con men, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the intriguing world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning con men. In this show, we will dig deep to reveal the dramatic and shocking intricacies of one man's elaborate crimes and reveal how he was dramatically brought to justice. The story of Carl Hildebrandt unfolds like a best-selling thriller. A man who was a fugitive from justice for almost a decade. Missing and presumed dead after a faked suicide, he evaded the police on both sides of the Atlantic until a bizarre twist of fate exposed his ingenious deception and the disturbing and shocking truth behind his disappearance.
In my opinion, Carl Hildebrandt is an excellent conman.
Carl Hildebrandt's family probably went through a living hell, wondering what had happened to their son.
Carl's mother certainly believed that her son had committed suicide. She thought he was dead.
The mystery of what had happened to Carl Hildebrandt would remain unsolved for 8 years, with the con man and the law playing a complex game of cat and mouse.
He was obviously a very determined and inventive individual, really.
The police suspected that he'd gone to South Africa, but they had no idea where Carl was.
I wonder whether he views himself as maybe a modern-day Robin Hood. He takes from the rich and gives to a more deserving cause himself.
The story begins in South Yorkshire, England in the late 1980s. Carl Hildebrandt lived in Rotherham and was well known in his local community.
Well, Carl Hildebrandt was a member of a well-established family business in Rotherham. On the face of it, a thriving business. He seemed to be very ambitious and upwardly mobile and looking for better things, I think.
The Hildebrandt business was a bakery at the Tan Yard in Wickersley. It was a well-known bakery business. They had 4 or 5 outlets in the Rotherham area and appeared to be quite successful, a local family bakery. What happened, as far as I can recollect, is that Carl took over the business and it ran for a short period of time after that and eventually closed down. Carl then opened a restaurant, the Waterloo Well in Wiston, which is a village just outside Rotherham. That didn't last very long either. I don't know exactly how long, perhaps a year or something like that. I don't think it was very successful.
With the family business running into financial difficulties, it seemed that Carl Hildebrandt began making money by less ethical means.
He was allegedly involved in a very complicated DTI scam. He was one of 6 men who were alleged to have defrauded the DTI out of a couple of £100,000 in bogus grants and various other things. Very complicated and typical of the sort of thing that Carl seemed to get involved in.
The DTI scam Carl Hildebrandt was accused of was an elaborate scheme. He and 5 other men were arrested and charged with fraud. The accusation was that the men had created fictitious firms and businesses in a sophisticated scheme to fraudulently obtain almost £200,000 in government grants. Hildebrandt was released on bail, due to stand trial in 1990. With an impending court case and the prospect of a prison sentence facing Carl Hildebrandt, it seems he had no intention of standing trial. Out on bail in 1989, Carl Hildebrandt and his then-girlfriend began to put the paperwork together to dramatically flee the country before the court case and then start a new life in South Africa. Carl Hildebrandt sold his Mercedes to a finance company for £28,000. He then promptly leased the same car back from them. One of the leasing conditions was that the car did not leave the UK. However, Carl Hildebrandt did not honour the agreement. He pocketed the profit from the sale and then stole the car. He took it to Belgium. The car was placed in a container along with personal possessions in the port of Zeebrugge, ready to be taken to South Africa. Phase 1 of the plan to start a new life abroad was completed, but Hildebrandt and his girlfriend would still need more cash to start their life overseas, and it appeared they had easy access to a lot of money.
He had a girlfriend at that time who worked for a Rotherham company, Nieser Eskefeld, who were a distribution outlet for grocery stores. She was quite senior secretary in there, I believe. 4 cheques were stolen from a chequebook belonging to the managing director of the company. Those cheques were made out for large sums of money, and eventually that was transferred into a sum in excess of £100,000. And those cheques were used to open a bank account in Leeds. Fictitious details were used, and it was never ascertained who actually opened that bank account. Well, the police suspected that Carl had opened that bank account. That's what they thought at the time.
There are a number of motives that con men employ in seeking to attain their goal. The one that we know most commonly is for financial gain, and we see this in the newspapers most often, where they've bilked either banks or individuals out of large sums of money. Another would be that they seek revenge or retribution because they feel they've been cheated in life and that they haven't gotten what they deserve, and they attempt to get that by conning others.
I think that we can all appreciate the law of a fast book, basically. And so there's a series of decisions that people would go through when contemplating a scam. You'd look at whether you could get away with it or not, what you stood to lose and what you stood to gain. It seems that at the time that Carl Hildebrandt started his scams, he was experiencing some financial strain, and so that to him would have been an indication that he didn't have too much to lose, but he had everything to gain.
Well, everyone have to search their individual conscience to decide if they felt strong enough to refuse a lot of money against doing something immoral and illegal. I mean, it's a calculation I guess that a lot of people make all the time, and they don't go down the criminal road.
Most of us don't lie because we're afraid that we'll get caught and we'll either be humiliated or punished. And con artists don't seem to have that same type of fear and anxiety.
Well, that money was used to buy a large amount of Krugerrands, which is a South African gold coin.
South African Krugerrands were first minted in 1967. Each coin contains 1 ounce of 22-carat gold. In today's market, 1 Krugerrand coin is worth in the region of £360, and Carl Hildebrandt was suspected of acquiring enough of them to live a very comfortable life in South Africa.
Well, I haven't counted how many Krugerrand coins Carl had, but he had £100,000 worth of these, allegedly. This is made of the finest gold, and these things are very, very expensive. At the time when Carl allegedly had these in his possession, they were worth over £100 each then.
With the police alerted to the stolen cheques and aware they'd been converted into Krugerrands, they began to connect Carl Hildebrandt to the crime. If their suspicions were right, his plan to leave the UK and head to South Africa was flawed.
I'm informed that Carl's mistake as far as these coins were concerned is that once you buy these coins in this country or any other country, you can't take them back into South Africa as a coin. You've got to change them back into the South African currency before you can take them back. This would ruin his plot because he would have to take a chance on being able to smuggle these coins through customs in South Africa, which probably would have been very difficult, bearing in mind that at the time we're talking about, South Africa was not a free and open country.
Carl Hildebrandt's trial date was approaching fast.
He was involved in other alleged financial scams where he was trying to obviously get hold of a lot of money with a view to skipping the country.
Well, the allegation, again, is that Carl was trying to sell these Krugerrands. Some of them were eventually recovered in a carrier bag in the back of a car at a garage in Mexborough.
Just a few days before Carl Hildebrandt and his then-girlfriend were due to flee the UK and fly to South Africa, the police made their move and caught up with them. They were arrested and interviewed on suspicion of theft and handling stolen goods.
Carl Hildebrandt was known to the police and therefore the press, really, because of his activities in some fairly dodgy financial dealings.
Well, he was interviewed on suspicion of theft of the cheques from the Nice Rycroft, the handling of stolen goods, which were the Krugerrands, because they were the proceeds of theft of the cheques. The car was found in Zeebrugge, so he was also interviewed for theft of that car, because that car, the Mercedes car, was on finance. And they also found documentation whereby he'd had a transit van on finance, and he'd actually sold that. They recovered that as well.
Now arrested and charged a second time, Carl Hildebrandt was facing 2 court cases, one for the DTI scam and the second for the stolen cheques. Things were not looking good for Carl Hildebrandt.
Having been charged with these offences, the girlfriend that Carl had at that time was granted bail. Carl was remanded in custody at Magistrates Court in Rotherham. His family offered to put up sureties for him, which were accepted by the court, and he was granted bail in the surety of 2 £50,000 sureties, with other bail conditions that he should reside at his home address and report to the police and sign the bail book at Rotherham Police Station.
But no one could have predicted Carl Hildebrandt's next move. Shortly after his family posted bail, Carl Hildebrandt executed his secret master plan that left the police, his family, and his local community shocked and devastated, creating a mystery that lasted almost a decade. In 1989, Carl Hildebrandt was facing charges of fraud, along with 5 other men. Before his day in court, Carl Hildebrandt had been charged a second time. He was arrested on suspicion of theft and handling stolen goods, after blank cheques were stolen from his girlfriend's workplace and cashed for £100,000. It was thought he was planning to use the money to leave the UK and flee to South Africa. He was remanded in custody until his family posted bail of £50,000.
The allegations regarding the original crimes, a lot of planning went into it. The opening of a false bank account, the preparation for flight, the car to Zeebrugge, all this was meticulously planned by Carl. So I would say he was certainly quite bright and did the job well.
In March 1990, just a few days before Carl Hildebrandt was due to stand trial in South Yorkshire, England, he stunned his family and local community by pulling a stunt that was to create a 10-year mystery.
He continued to sign the bail book for some considerable time. There became a time when he just didn't turn up to sign the bail book. He was circulated as wanted by the South Yorkshire Police for breach of his bail conditions. The date of his court date, where he was supposed to arrive for committal, that passed, and a warrant was issued from Rotherham Magistrates Court for failing to appear.
Carl Hildebrandt had disappeared. The search was on for the fugitive, but just 2 days after his disappearance, the police received a phone call revealing an unexpected twist in the tale. It seemed Hildebrandt would not stand trial. On the face of it, it appeared that Carl Hildebrandt was dead.
The next thing we heard was he was due to appear in court, and the police were saying that they'd found his car in the Humber estuary. He'd hired a car, driven it into the Humber estuary, with obviously the implication that he'd committed suicide.
With Carl Hildebrandt's car submerged in the perilous River Humber in northern England, the Humberside Underwater Police Squad was scrambled to recover his body.
We were called out to assess the situation. Arriving at the scene, we could see a partially submerged vehicle, and at that time we could only distinguish it was red in colour. It's not common, but it's not unheard of for people to commit suicide in this fashion. The search we did was wearing full diving equipment. I was elected as the diver on the day. I entered the water, searched in and around the vehicle to establish that there was nobody in the vehicle. Due to the type of water, the River Humber, there's so much suspended silt. There's no visibility whatsoever once you go under the water. So it was a case of searching around the vehicle, and in this event I actually removed the vehicle registration mark and came back up to the surface to enable me to read it. I passed that information on to my colleagues on the riverbank, and they conducted a police national computer check of the vehicle registration mark.
That car was traced to a car hire company in Parkgate, Rotherham, and the owner was able to confirm that Carl Hildebrandt had hired that car.
The police had directly linked the submerged car to Carl Hildebrandt, but the circumstances were mysterious, and while his family grieved, the police were suspicious. No body was recovered from the river, and the question began to emerge: what had actually happened to Carl Hildebrandt? Had the man facing charges drowned himself to avoid having to go to trial, or had he faked his death?
It had sort of connotations of Reggie Perrin to it, the TV series where clothes were left at the side of the river and Reggie was never seen again.
He was very much missing but presumed dead, and it was very much a story out of a thriller rather than an average Rotherham crime story.
It was believed that he'd tried to fool everyone into believing that he'd committed suicide. The police never ever believed that, but Carl's mother certainly did.
Well, few things in life are as painful as losing a child. And for a person to have that level of disregard for the feelings of someone who reared them is inconceivable to most of us in society.
Carl Hildebrandt's family probably went through a living hell, wondering what had happened to their son.
She definitely suspected that he had killed himself by drowning in the River Humber. She in fact blamed the police for that at the time. She was very, very upset about it.
They would have had numerous unanswered questions. Their life probably would be just a series of wonderings, you know, looking at people on the street. Could that be him? Where is he? Has something dreadful happened to him? If you don't have a body and you don't have the answers to those questions, you've got no closure, and it's very difficult for people to then move on and move forward in their lives.
What we know about grief is that it's easier to resolve the grief if you have the ritual, the funeral, the ability to say goodbye. And when there's no body and the person's presumed dead and just missing, their grief is prolonged because they always wonder, what happened? You know, was there something I could have done to prevent it?
Carl Hildebrandt's family may have believed that the River Humber in northern England had taken his life, but not everyone was so certain.
It was obvious from the police's attitude that they weren't at all convinced that that's what he'd actually done, and they seemed to be treating it as very much an attempt to escape justice. So from the outset, the hunt was on, basically. They were very much looking for a Carl Hildebrandt who was alive and well.
Carl Hildebrandt's actions in faking his own death, to me, appear to be the actions of a desperate man, a man who is panicking and is totally focused on himself and making a good escape. It takes a certain type of personality to be able to make a clear cut away from friends and family and just to start again under a new identity. You have to be quite a superficial person, quite a self-centred person to be able to cause your family to believe that you are dead and not take any actions to put that right, but also to be able to emotionally separate from people in such a sudden and shocking manner. And at no point did he try and attempt to make any kind of contact to put his family out of misery.
The police investigation obviously couldn't go any further until they could find Carl, because they'd gathered all the evidence they required for the prosecutions. There was nothing more they could do but to put it on hold.
The hunt for Hildebrandt may have hit a dead end, but this mysterious and dramatic story of a car being discovered in northern England's River Humber with no body inside was not going to go away.
The Sheffield Star, on the anniversary of Carl's disappearance, annually ran a story about it with a photograph of Carl and where is he now, that sort of thing.
Because the police never closed the case, and because they were always actively searching for him, and there were also various rumours that used to pop up. I mean, at one stage, apparently, he'd come back to see some mates and then slipped away again. I don't think that was ever proven to be the case, but it was a very strong rumour. It's the only case of its kind I've ever reported on, and not something that you would expect to report on in a court in Rotherham, basically. So, very unique. And obviously, from our point of view, you know, the local media, it was a great story, so we were obviously keen to keep it going. So we kept printing the stories quite regularly. The police were still hunting for him, reporting on the rumours.
And I suspect they ran that for 7 or 8 years.
In Carl Hildebrandt's absence, life in his hometown continued. In 1991, 4 of the men involved in the elaborate government fraud, allegedly with Hildebrandt, were jailed. Then, 5 years later, in 1996, Carl Hildebrandt's father died, not knowing whether his son was alive or dead. But in all this time, the police had not given up their search. Interpol had become involved in the hunt, but Hildebrandt appeared to have vanished into thin air. Almost a decade after his mysterious disappearance, whether alive or dead, it seemed doubtful that Carl Hildebrandt would ever be seen again. That is, until a remarkable and dramatic breakthrough that came directly out of the blue, 8 years after Carl Hildebrandt's disappearance back in 1990.
The real stroke of luck came one day when some bloke back from his holidays in America opened the Star, and there was a story about Carl Hildebrandt missing, presumed dead, with a photograph of him, and he realised that, hang on, I've been having a drink with that bloke, and it wasn't Carl Hildebrandt, it was Charles Staines. So told the paper, and that was that. The hunt was on again.
He was quite successful until he decided to mix it with a guy from Sheffield.
By pure coincidence, the police's instincts were confirmed. Rotherham's Reggie Perrin was alive.
Well, this was a great piece of luck for the South Yorkshire Police. They had no idea where Carl was, and here we had a guy from South Yorkshire who was telling them, and not only was he telling them what name he was using as well. Charlie Staines.
So he was living under an assumed identity, and that gave the police something more to work with.
We had no idea how he'd come across that name or why he'd assumed that name at that particular time, except that was the name he was using in Fort Lauderdale.
The name Charles Staines may have been a mystery yet to be solved, but for the first time in 8 years, in England, the Yorkshire Police finally had the breakthrough they'd been hoping for. But this was just the beginning. The police had confirmed their suspicions, but they had a long way to go. Locating and extraditing him from the USA would not be easy. Bringing Carl Hildebrandt to justice was still a long shot. But luck seemed to be on Brian Sutton and the South Yorkshire Police's side. In another twist of fate, they were contacted by a Florida resident, the disgruntled ex-girlfriend of Charles Staines, aka Carl Hildebrandt. The police were just another step closer to catching their man.
I had a stroke of luck at that time because Carl had allegedly been concerned with ripping off a British subject who lived in Fort Lauderdale. She contacted me, knowing that I was interested in Carl, which resulted in me talking to a private investigator in America by the name of Richard Stein, who was on Carl's case, if that's the term to use, and he was feeding me information about Carl on a regular basis, so I knew that he was using the name Charles Norman Staines.
Step by step, Brian Sutton was getting closer to trapping his quarry. As the investigation progressed, he discovered, over in the USA, the Fort Lauderdale police were well aware of a Charles Staines, even if the name Carl Hildebrandt meant absolutely nothing to them.
Charles Staines was a cunning individual. He was very calculated in what he did. He was very careful in what he did.
Carl Hildebrandt had inadvertently helped the South Yorkshire police over in Britain with their quest. In May 1997, Hildebrandt, under his assumed identity Charles Staines, had been arrested.
He was initially arrested one time under the name Charles Staines. That was for a problem he had with his girlfriend, and there was a burglary and a domestic fight. He was booked under that name here in Fort Lauderdale in Broward County, Florida, as Charles Staines. Later, I become to learn through some information that he was really Carl Hildebrandt.
But Carl Hildebrandt, or Charles Staines as he was known in the USA, soon came to the police's attention for a second time. The Florida police connected him to an intricate and ambitious scam.
Mr. Staines had experience in the rental car industry, had worked in a rental car company for a little while, so he knew how the voucher system worked. He would counterfeit vouchers, and these vouchers were used mostly by travel agents. So if a consumer in the UK wanted to go on a trip, they would go to their travel agent, they would make a reservation for a hotel, an airline, and a rental car, usually at the same time, and they would get these vouchers. And these vouchers were like cash. They would be presented at the counter to the rental car companies here, and they would be given a car. So what he did is to make a little shortcut for the consumers over there. He counterfeited these vouchers. He would advertise in the local newspaper there of a discounted rate for rental cars. And the person would buy those discounted vouchers, use them over here, but he was getting to keep the cash in his pocket. And the consumer was turning in a voucher and getting a car. They would use the car for a week, 10 days, they would go back home, and the rental car companies never caught on to it right away.
Carl Hildebrandt had an opportunity when he went to America to effectively go straight, but he didn't take that opportunity. Rather, he took the opportunity that presented itself to him through his car rental company to actually start ripping off yet another big organisation.
It was pretty clever because the rental car companies hadn't caught on to it for a while. Matter of fact, when a car turns up missing, it usually takes them a little while to report it stolen, and most of the time, by then, the tourists that had these cars had returned them, and they had given up investigating on it, so a lot of them went unchecked. He actually did get away for about 18 months.
A lot of con men do believe that they're a cut above the normal person, and not just criminals. They don't even believe they're criminals at all. That's a classic trait of a con man. Doesn't believe he or she is an actual criminal because they don't believe that what they're doing is true crime. They believe that they're just being smarter than other people, and well, they wouldn't describe it as taking advantage of other people. They would describe it as being smarter than the other guy, and if he's not smart enough, that's his lookout.
Now, it seems that there must be something intrinsic in this man's personality that makes it okay for him to do this. He obviously doesn't view it as morally wrong. He knows that it's legally unacceptable, but it's okay for him to do that. I wonder whether he views himself as maybe a modern-day Robin Hood. He takes from the rich and gives to a more deserving cause himself.
The money was going to good use for him. Mr. Hildebrandt liked to be in the social life. There were several clubs that he was known to frequent and hang out at. He had a few girls that he kept on the side there, but a lot of his time was spent doing his criminal activities and other elements. He was involved in other elements of crime as well. So he associated with people in different realms.
So if he even thought about it consciously, he may well have thought, well, you know, I haven't got the attributes to go straight, so this is the only life I know. And I think a lot of con artists do say that they find that they can't go straight and this is the only life they know, so they've got to stick with it.
With the UK and US police both closing in, Carl Hildebrandt's days on the run were numbered, and with his capture came the sick and devastating revelations of how he succeeded in dodging the police for almost a decade. And the answers were to be found in a graveyard. In 1990, Carl Hildebrandt was facing police charges of fraud, theft and handling stolen goods. At the 11th hour, shortly before he stood trial, he vanished. Missing and presumed dead, the local UK press crowned him Yorkshire's Reggie Perrin.
Well, faking your own death may be the ultimate con.
From our point of view, the story never really died because the police were obviously still actively looking for him and treating him as very much alive.
Well, it seems that the decision to move to America and assume a new identity arose out of panic because Carl had been caught trying to scam big companies in Britain. So for him to then start again in America tells me that there's something intrinsic in this man's personality.
Because con artists have an inability to delay gratification, they want what they want now, and they want it the easiest possible way without doing the work. So, for example, with Mr. Hildebrandt, where he came over to the United States and had an opportunity to sort of go straight and live a conventional life, he chose not to do that because of those traits.
While in Fort Lauderdale, Carl Hildebrandt was using the name Charles Staines, and the US police had linked him to a number of criminal activities. In a twist of fate, while the South Yorkshire police were uncovering what happened to Hildebrandt in the UK, over in the USA in 1998, the Florida police were searching for him in connection to a car rental scam.
The Fort Lauderdale police were on his case. A detective by the name of Russell Spies eventually arrested him. Carl was charged with criminal offences in Fort Lauderdale and remanded to Chrome Detention Centre in Miami.
Mr. Staines was arrested by virtue of a setup that we had done. We had some informants working that had asked to meet at a certain location, and they had invited Mr. Staines or Mr. Hildebrandt to meet at that location with this informant too. When he arrived, we were set up in many different positions with a lot of agents, and he was taken down in front of a business without any incident.
With the Carl Hildebrandt file now reopened in South Yorkshire and their attention focused on Florida, the American and British police began working together.
So I was told that he was a fugitive from England. So the only way to verify that was through his fingerprints. So I was able to contact the police in South Yorkshire, Detective Sutton. We corresponded back and forth. Eventually, he had sent me a copy of Carl Hildebrandt's fingerprints.
The positive identification came when I sent a certified copy of Carl's fingerprints from the date when he was arrested and charged for the original offences to Russell Spies in Fort Lauderdale.
We took them to our fingerprint examiner here at the Broward County Sheriff's Office and compared them to the previous ones of Charles Staines that was arrested on his separate burglary charge. They put the two together, and sure enough, we knew we had Mr. Hildebrandt. Mr. Brian Sutton seemed very excited to know that he has finally found the person he's been looking for a long time, and was very eager to provide me with any information, any assistance that I needed to ensure that this capture was made and that they were able to get their man back.
And now the US and UK police had solved their mystery, it was time to let Carl Hildebrandt in on their discovery.
Well, when after I arrested Mr. Staines and I told him that I knew he was Carl Hildebrandt, his reaction wasn't vocal in his words, but his expressions told all. He just lowered his head and closed his eyes, and I can see it all in his face that he knew it was over.
Well, often con men feel superior, and those feelings of superiority may increase the longer that they're able to engage in their scam. So when they're caught, it may be a crushing experience because they've assumed this new identity and they thought that they pretty much were scot-free.
With Hildebrandt behind bars in the USA, the game was up. However, there was one last piece of the puzzle remaining unanswered. Where had Carl Hildebrandt found the identity Charles Staines? An identity that had kept him safely concealed from the British police and Interpol's extensive searches.
Well, at that time, it didn't mean anything except that he was using another name. I was able to get the date of birth he was using, and as a result of that, we were able to find out that Charles Norman Staines had been a young man born in, I believe, North Ferriby in Humberside, who died at age 5 when he drowned in the River Humber, and Carl had assumed his name.
But as Brian Sutton began to probe further, the disturbing discoveries kept coming.
Well, what we found out was that Carl was in possession of 2 passports because he'd used another one, Dean Anthony Perry, on a trip to Guyana In South America, we also found out that this young lad Perry had also died in Humberside at about the same time, and it became apparent that he'd probably gone to a cemetery, found two young boys who died about the same age that he was, gone and obtained birth certificates, and then obtained passports, and it is as simple as that.
The idea to take a child's identity from a gravestone comes straight out of The Day of the Jackal, so it's quite possible that he got that idea from a book that he might have had on his bedside table. This wasn't the criminal genius at work, this is a desperate man.
We then went to the passport office in Peterborough, where we found the original application for the passport by the person who assumed the name of Charles Norman Staines, and the passport photograph was Carl.
At the point at which Carl Hildebrandt stole the dead child's identity, he was not thinking of the impact of that upon the child's parents. He was thinking about himself and purely about himself. I doubt that it would have crossed his mind. He just wanted to make an escape. To him, he probably felt that the child didn't need the name any longer anyway.
The traits of a good con man are... Well, there's numerous ones, but I think the main one is a complete lack of conscience. Basically, you can't afford to worry about your victims, about whether or not you might have hurt them, or if you've done something wrong, or how they might be feeling.
The usage of the name of Charles Norman Staines, providing that boy's parents never found out, would not have been a problem to anyone. But of course, when we were pursuing the offences of the passport offences, it was necessary to visit the parents of Charles Norman Staines, who were very nice people, elderly, living in Humberside. Although it was a long time before, they clearly were distressed at the thought that we were making this investigation.
Well, the family of the person whose identity that he stole were likely very, very damaged by what he did. It's bad enough to lose a child, but when you get that phone call from an investigator or the police that someone has stolen the identity of this child that you loved and lost, it's a sense of violation to the very innermost part of your being, and such a sense of betrayal that it's very difficult to overcome.
The family of Charles Staines would have been immensely affected by the identity of their child effectively being stolen. Although the child doesn't need that identity any longer, because sadly they're dead, they would have viewed that name which they carefully chose for their son as very precious to them. It would have represented their son who's not physically with them anymore. And so to have that stolen would be like having a physical part of themselves removed. It'd be tantamount to grave robbery.
In a letter to this documentary, the parents of Charles Staines said, "Even 40 years on, we grieve for our little boy. The fact that Carl Hildebrandt stole his identity is doubly painful, as we feel Charles's innocence was stolen and he can't rest in peace. Our son was named after his father and grandfather. Hildebrandt besmirched the name of the honourable men." The stealing of the names of dead people is the fastest growing identity theft crime in the UK. The UK's Passport Service now holds a database of babies' births and deaths dating back to the 1950s. So serious is the problem that they have produced a worldwide warning database with a total of 1,000 names of deceased babies whose identities may have been used by fraudsters. An initiative called Operation Wisdom was also launched in 2002, targeting people assuming the identities of dead children. Within the first 2 years, 255 arrests were made with 50 convictions. The Home Office have also introduced a new system where the 600,000 people who annually apply for first-time adult passports will have to take part in a face-to-face interview. This process will be extended to anyone renewing a lost, stolen or expired passport by 2009, making it much harder for people to inflict the heartache and suffering that Carl Hildebrandt caused to the Staines family.
What we do know is that these passports, the two passports that Carl Hildebrandt obtained, were applied for and obtained during the period that he was signing the bail book at Rotherham Police Station. So he was planning flight whilst he was on bail. It wouldn't have taken too long. I mean, I know from experience that you can fill the application form in and turn up at the passport office in Peterborough, and providing you've got the fee and you're prepared to sit and wait, they'll issue you with the passport there and then.
By 1999, the long-standing mystery of Carl Hildebrandt's assumed identity and location was finally solved. But with Carl Hildebrandt in US custody due to the car rental scam in Fort Lauderdale, the police now had to work out how to get him back on British soil to face the charges that he fled from almost 10 years earlier.
He stayed in jail for about a year until his trial date actually came about. The judge refused to let him out on any bond. He stayed in jail. His trial date came, and the judge decided to go ahead and release him on a condition that he get on a plane immediately to return to England to face charges that were awaiting for him there. And that was the agreement that was struck between him, his attorney, and us here.
Now acquitted of the charges in the US, Hildebrandt was escorted back to the UK to finally face charges that he had fled from 8 years earlier. But no one could be prepared for what was to happen when he finally faced justice. Carl Hildebrandt's story reads like a bestseller. He faked his own death and then stole a dead child's identity to avoid standing trial in 1990 on charges of handling stolen goods and fraud. Missing and presumed dead, Carl Hildebrandt fled the UK and started a secret new life overseas.
By the time the police found the car in the River Humber, it's possible that Carl had already gone. We're not certain because we have no recollection of where he went from and to, but he could have already gone by then.
It was almost 10 years after his mysterious disappearance that the police finally caught up with him in the USA. Carl Hildebrandt was using the name Charles Staines, but despite the intricate planning to escape justice in the UK, on the other side of the world, Rotherham's Reggie Perrin was still getting himself into scrapes with the police.
If Mr. Staines had not engaged in some criminal activity upon coming to the United States, there's a good chance he never would have been caught. Had he conducted himself in a polite, professional manner and done something constructive and real, he may be still walking around the streets here in the United States today as Mr. Charles Staines.
The allegation came over that he'd been arrested in Mobile initially for some sort of car crime. They bailed him and he'd done a runner again. He eventually got arrested by the police at Fort Lauderdale, a detective there by the name of Russell Spies, who dealt with him for offences connected with cars.
Was I surprised he was wanted in the UK? Not really, because I've heard so many stories in my 27 years in law enforcement, but it was just amazing that I actually got involved in a case like this, and it was quite intriguing once I heard the details of what had happened over there, and I thought, well, this is going to be a decent case to work, and it turned out it was. The judge said and agreed with his attorney and our prosecutor that he would be released now only to get on a plane to fly back to England to face the charges that he had to face there.
With the UK and US police working together, August 1999 finally saw all their hard work pay off.
He'd already served about 12 months in custody. His time was served, and he was brought on an aeroplane back to Manchester Airport by two officers from Crome Detention Centre. Carl came back to Manchester Airport at about 9:30 a.m. one morning. We went to collect him and bring him back to Rotherham Police Station. He was perfectly okay. He was very friendly and no aggravation whatsoever. It wasn't a personal thing between myself and Carl, but it did close a book as far as the South Yorkshire Police were concerned, because he'd been missing for 8 years, and we got him back, so it was a closure.
As far as the police are aware, it was the first time Carl Hildebrandt had stepped on British soil in almost a decade. Now home, the family who believed he had drowned when his car was found in the River Humber had their son back.
For somebody who's got a very rich life and has got close attachments to their friends and family, the thought of actually faking their own death would be unthinkable. I think the fact that Carl was able to do this tells you that this is somebody who has got very superficial attachments to other people, is maybe very egocentric and really just focused on himself.
I don't know whether Carl ever contacted his mother during the 8 years he was on the run, but what I do know is that when we did eventually bring him back to Rotherham, she came and complained that we hadn't informed her that we got him and that she still thought he was dead. So the suggestion is he'd never contacted his mother or his sister. She was very distraught. She would have to be a very good actress to convince the police that she was acting, and I believe she was genuine. She thought he was dead.
And with Rotherham's Reggie Perrin back in the UK, it was time for him to face justice. Ironically, most of the previous charges that he had spent so much effort and energy evading were dropped. Carl Hildebrandt was charged with theft, passport offences, perverting the course of justice, and failure to answer bail.
When we got him back, a decision was made by the Crown Prosecution Service that they could not proceed with the original offences of theft of the cheques. The law had changed during the 8 years, and it was now apparently not possible to steal paper cheques. So they decided not to proceed with that, or the handling of the Krugerrands. So the offences Carl was recharged with were the theft of the Mercedes, the passport offences, failing to answer bail, and perverting the course of justice. The perversion was that he'd faked his death and led people to believe that he wasn't ever going to be able to appear at court because he was dead.
In April 2000, 8 months after returning to the UK, Carl Hildebrandt stood trial, facing 8 criminal charges, although the prosecution did not pursue the charge of perverting the course of justice. At the trial, the judge, Peter Baker, described the case as a fascinating and bizarre story. He said that Hildebrandt's story read more like a novel than a criminal case. Carl Hildebrandt's mother said, "We'll all be happy when it comes to an end. It's gone on too long." After disappearing in 1990, leaving his friends and family to believe he had been lost to the River Humber in northern England, it is thought that Hildebrandt spent time in South Africa before setting up residency in the USA. And after running from the charges facing him in South Yorkshire for almost a decade, Carl Hildebrandt was eventually sentenced to just 15 months in prison. A local newspaper commented, "He need never have fled." Having served his time, he is now free and living in the UK. But the impact of the con, which draws parallels to Frederick Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal and the famous sitcom The Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, he will long be remembered.
These might have been the actions of a desperate man who was looking at a possible jail term and desperately wanted to make his escape. But he never, at any point in the 10 years that he was living under an assumed identity, tried to get in contact with his family to actually put that right.
I've never come across a faking of death and obtaining passports by deception before during my career, and I would say that it's not a common crime, although not too difficult to do. And what is also the case is that these 2 passports have never been recovered.
For somebody to live on the run for so long, I think you'd have to say that, yeah, he's a successful con man.
In my opinion, Carl Hildebrandt is an excellent con man.
Carl Hildebrandt was a cunning individual. He was very calculated in what he did. He was very careful in what he did, but like anybody else, they always make a mistake here and a mistake there, and it always catches up to him. But I think he was clever. He was very witty. There's no question about it. He was sauvé. He liked to play with the women a lot and get around, but eventually bad people always get caught, and that's our job to find them.
Without doubt in my mind, Glenn Rycroft's one of Britain's biggest con men.
I think for any of us, the idea of telling your mother that you've got cancer and only a limited period of time of life left is just appalling if it's just not true.
He's hurt me, he's hurt my family, and he's hurt an awful lot of other people as well.
We're talking about people who he'd known for a very, very long time, some people who'd actually assisted him in his career, people who assisted him throughout his education, and you're talking about people who lost their life savings.
And it was a horrible feeling to have, that someone who's told you they've got cancer and you're thinking, you know, maybe they haven't.
If you can't trust this guy, who can you trust?
Glenn Rycroft grew up in Salford near Manchester in England. After leaving school, he went on to become an air steward for British Airways.
Glenn Rycroft was in his early 20s, worked for British Airways, had a good job, and very, very likeable character, very personable with people, and very, very, very popular.
He was extremely plausible. He was a nice, likeable lad. You felt somewhere along the line that he was a guy that had come out of a bad background. Salford isn't the best of places to be, but was starting to make something of himself. He was setting up pension plans in the form of small businesses that he could retire on when he finished flying.
No one had a wrong word to say about him, and obviously it came as a total shock of what he was actually doing because he was so personable and likeable.
Personable and likeable, necessary traits for a successful confidence trickster, Rycroft was to become a master. His tissue of deceit began in the year 2000, long before his cruel cancer claims. He began his conman career with a straightforward and plausible financial scam. He started to approach friends and family, offering them the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to invest in a lucrative British Airways share scheme. The only trouble was the share scheme was totally fictitious. The plan was simple. People gave Rycroft money to invest on their behalf, and Rycroft pocketed all the so-called invested cash for himself.
He was a steward and said he'd been given this opportunity to invest his own money in British Airways, but he'd invest it on behalf of them through himself.
The theory of it was that if you invest for a short term, it was slightly less, a longer term would be more, but in general, you were looking at around about a 12-month turnaround and around about 20 or 23% of return on investment, depending on the type of deal that you were doing, the amount that you put in.
The majority of all his family and friends invested money in him, with expecting a return for their money within a 6-month to 12-month period.
The whole thing was an underhand scam. The scheme didn't exist, but because Rycroft had targeted people he knew, they trusted him. Little did they know that their money was being used to pay for Rycroft's newfound high-flying lifestyle.
The fact that Glenn Rycroft targeted his friends and family, local businessmen, was quite clever in as much as they already trusted him. They knew he worked for BA, so there was an element of truth in the lies that he told which made them more plausible.
It's kind of a version of what we call a high-yield investment scheme, which is where you basically con people into believing that you're offering them a unique opportunity where they can get really high returns, much higher returns they could get through any legitimate means. And it's a classic instance of something that seems too good to be true. Of course it is, but people don't see it that way. They either because they trust the con man or because they're misled by their own greed.
I would say that had Glenn Rycroft come up to a stranger's house, knocked on his door at 8 o'clock some evening and tried to sell this BA investment scam, people would have seen through it. As with a lot of fraudsters who are successful, it's the initial contact and the initial hurdles of trust that they need to get over. Glenn Rycroft didn't need to do that. The trust and the belief in him was already there.
One of his best friend's parents, his best friend's parents invested their life savings with him, cash, because they trusted him so much. And then it was a self-referral from there, really. It stayed generally within the family circle, but then some of the families introduced other people into it, friends of theirs who Glenn Rycroft didn't know, and they also invested on the trust that they were getting from the family of how reliable he was.
In retrospect, it all seems very irrational that we could believe this, but at the time, he's a young guy, he's the right age, he's got the right kit, he's doing all the right things. From our perspective, he was an air steward and a bright, cheerful and very respectable guy. Absolutely, totally and utterly believable.
One of the businesses Rycroft bought with the money was a newsagent's. He leased the property from Granville Goff, and Glenn Rycroft calculatingly presented himself as a consummate young professional to draw Goff into his devious scam.
We met him occasionally to talk about different things, one of which was the investment scheme, and he would turn up smart as a new pin, blue jacket on, hat under the arm, BA tie, ready to go flying. He was on his way down to Manchester Airport to catch the shuttle down to get his flight out. And to all intents and purposes, he was a BA man, through and through. And we had no reason to believe otherwise.
It wasn't long before Granville Goff was presented with the opportunity to invest in Rycroft's devious scheme.
He suggested there was a way of being involved with his British Airways pension schemes. It seemed to be a good idea. It was offering a good rate of return. Seemed a pretty secure company to be with, and as a consequence, we got involved. He had quite a considerable number of investors, some of them quite substantial amounts of money. And basically, when I asked what we were talking about in the way of substantial amounts of money, he said that at the moment he's got around about £600,000 invested of various different people as well as his own. So the 10,000 that I was looking at, just to try it out, seemed to be pretty small beer.
Friends, family and neighbours believed their money would yield a large return on their investment, depending upon the amount they initially spent. Little did they know that their return would be zero, and their invested cash would just vanish.
The money was used to fund an extravagant lifestyle, not for himself, but he actually treated his friends as well, but invariably it was basically going on trips around the world, renting a luxury apartment in Worsley, having all mod comms in the apartment, rental vehicles, buying into businesses, you name it, he basically had his hand in everything.
When Glenn Rycroft was working for the cabin crew for British Airways, he might well have seen things that really drove him to aspire to that sort of lifestyle. And I think quite often with con artists, it's not just about the material aspect, it's more about what money and status and things like that represent. So it's respect. It's more the idea of a lifestyle, and he might well have picked up on all that when he was in the cabin crew.
He went to the Bahamas, he went to Portugal, he went to Paris a number of times, and he was driving around America. I think he went there for 2 to 3 weeks, took friends with him and spent thousands.
His friends clearly thought Rycroft's investments were doing well for him, in order to be able to afford to treat them to these lavish holidays.
And to give an indication of the whim of this particular character, he flew to Florida from the Bahamas purely and simply because it was overcast one day. Now, he'd treated some friends and took them out there completely free of charge to them. He footed the bill, and it was all stolen money that he'd conned out of people. He flew to Australia. He flew to several locations in America, and he stayed in the best resorts. He stayed at a 5-star golfing resort in Portugal. He doesn't even play golf. You know, so this is the extravagant and arrogant existence that this man carried out.
But the lucrative con did not have an exit strategy. People were expecting a return on the money they'd invested. With the clock ticking and the pressure on, Rycroft was in danger of being exposed as a fraud and a criminal. And so, many believe in an act of desperation and impulse, he played his cruel masterstroke. To evade, or at least postpone detection, Rycroft did the unimaginable. He lied to his nearest and dearest, telling them he was terminally ill.
It obviously started coming on top for Glenn Rycroft, where he would have to start paying money back. So to enforce really the deception really and facilitate him getting more money, he actually came up with a story that he was suffering from brain cancer.
Glenn Rycroft was living the high life in Salford, Greater Manchester in the UK. Working as an air steward, Rycroft approached his friends, family and neighbours with an amazingly lucrative but completely fictitious British Airways investment scheme. With his nearest and dearest expecting the rewards of the scheme at any time, Rycroft was now in danger of being cornered and caught out.
There was always going to be a fatal flaw because it had to come to an end. You know, you had a relationship with these people and they wanted to see a return on their investment, and that just wasn't going to happen. So he clearly hadn't thought of an exit strategy for this con.
A new con was born out of his BA scam in an ingenious but short-sighted exit strategy. Rycroft avoided paying out the money he owed by claiming he had cancer. In November 2000, Glenn Rycroft left his job as a cabin crew member using another lie, this time that his mother had cancer. A month later, Rycroft told his investors, friends and family a different lie. He was on sick leave and had a cancerous brain tumour.
Coming up to when people started expecting a return on the funds, it obviously started coming on top for Glenn Rycroft, where he would have to start paying money back. So to enforce really the deception really and facilitate him getting more money, he actually came up with a story that he was suffering from brain cancer and he'd been diagnosed and it was potential that he was going to die.
He came back apparently rather abruptly from one of his many meandering trips and said that he'd been diagnosed as having terminal cancer with probably less than 12 months to live.
Using cancer as a con is got to be the bottom of the barrel. It really is the most appalling way of taking money from other people.
Choosing cancer as his disease of choice, just in terms of the mechanics of his actual con, it's quite well suited because you can drag it out for a long time, but you can always be on death's door at the same time. And then plausibly you could need treatment in various other places and have to travel. So it really ticked all his boxes in that sense. In terms of the psychology of his victims, cancer is it's still a tender point. It's something that isn't talked about a great deal. Because it's quite a taboo area, it probably maintains quite a lot of mystery around it. So therefore it makes sense in terms of the psychology of his victims. They're not likely to probe too much, they're not likely to ask too many questions, too many awkward questions. So in that sense, it's a really good choice.
It's just something that you find very hard to come to terms with. I mean, just think of your own loved ones. Can you imagine going home tonight and saying to them, look, I've got 2 months to live, I'm dying of a brain tumour. Just think of the emotion and the difficulty that would take. It's just unbelievable that anybody would stoop to such a callous and calculated deception as that. But this lad did, and he did it with no remorse whatsoever.
It's torturous, I would have thought, on his mother, because his mother's a nice person. Same with his sisters, they're nice.
I think for any of us, the idea of telling your mother that you've got cancer and only a limited period of time of life left is just appalling if it's just not true. I mean, none of us could really understand how someone can do that unless you have this sort of psychopathic tendency to detach yourself emotionally from the situation.
No one's going to ask a dying man, no one's going to ask him difficult questions about a business plan, no one's going to put him on the spot in terms of coughing up money that they've invested. So you could argue that that's a sort of diabolical way of sidestepping the consequences of his initial scam. I'm not sure that he was necessarily that calculating, because quite often psychopaths aren't. In fact, he said himself that when he claimed to have cancer, it was just something that just occurred to him. He didn't know why he did it. He just started saying that.
I think Glenn Rycroft exhibits quite a few traits of a psychopath. He has this emotional detachment, lack of conscience, and the ability to con people that he knew and who loved him.
With the cancer con successfully born out of his British Airways scam, Rycroft was safe for now. And like any master con man, Rycroft thoroughly researched his subject matter, so he was utterly convincing.
His initial research into the disease, the symptoms, the treatments was all painstakingly taken on board by him. We know from speaking to close associates who were victims and witnesses in the case that he used to spend quite a lot of time on the internet. So the World Wide Web is a reservoir of endless information that he researched. He also purchased medical books, specifically about oncology and similar subjects, medicines that people might use for treatment and the like.
And he created quite a plausible scenario for people to believe. And most of us are very sympathetic and have empathy for people who have serious illness.
To facilitate this stage of the con, Rycroft ensured no one questioned his fictional illness, and he audaciously began to dramatically and disturbingly display the symptoms of a man with cancer.
In order to convince people of his illness, Rycroft would look very gaunt. He would tell people he was tired and not feeling well. He would display hair loss. He actually shaved his head and gave people the general impression that he'd received chemotherapy. There was one particular evening that one of the witnesses recounts. They were in the home and Rycroft went out of the lounge, only to return several minutes later screaming in pain and displaying what looked like blood running from his ears, his nose, his eyes and his mouth. We now know that he actually went to a joke shop in Manchester and purchased fake blood capsules. And when I spoke to the individuals about that, they were so shocked and traumatised at being suddenly confronted with this that even today they find it hard to come to terms with that somebody could be so callous as to do something like that.
Not content with disturbing and upsetting those closest to him, he then set about conning them out of their cash.
Rycroft's friends and associates were so trusting of him that when he confronted them with symptoms, they accepted anything that he was prepared to say. Bearing in mind that Rycroft was saying that he was receiving treatment from the National Health Service and from Bupa, he was quoting these medical organisations to his friends, and what would happen is they would do what he asked. And if he said, I don't need an ambulance, they wouldn't get one. He would say that this is all part of the symptoms and to trust him, which is what people did. They were really taken in by him.
It was quite clear that he could just lie on the cuff. I mean, some of the stories that he come up with are absolutely, to this date, when I've sat here now 3-4 years down the line, are still unbelievable and still amaze me when I think back about what he used to say. Yeah, he would just, anything at all, he would lie about anything, and I have no qualms about the type or how extravagant the lie was. It wouldn't bother him one little bit. People
gave to what they firmly believe was an honest and worthy cause, and that would be to try and finance the private research and treatment of Glenn Rycroft, believing genuinely that he was a cancer sufferer.
In all honesty, I thought it was a genuine attempt to raise money for a lad who was on death's doorstep.
It was just a tissue of lies and deceit that he wove to convince people of his illness.
In true psychopathic fashion, Rycroft convinced his community that nothing could be done for him in Britain, but a letter from a fictitious Professor Knowles stated there was hope elsewhere, with a hefty price tag.
He'd actually identified that there was a treatment in Australia that wasn't recognised by the British Medical Board, but it was very, very expensive, £250,000, and needed money to go over, because that was possibly his only chance of actually being able to beat the condition that he had. He managed to get hold of a letter-headed paper from Steppenwell Hospital and have it copied onto blank paper, obviously, at a local stationery's. From there, he typed up a letter confirming from an alleged consultant professor that he had this condition that he was purported to have.
Rycroft targeted local business people, including Ray Fisher, to help fund his bogus treatment. And Glenn Rycroft looked every inch the cancer victim.
It was a family friend who introduced Glenn to myself and mentioned that he was poorly and he was looking for anyone who could make a donation for some treatment in Australia. Well, he turned up at the office, he had a baseball cap on, he'd pulled down over his face, he'd lost a lot of weight, he didn't look well. We had a letter from Stepping Hill Hospital from a specialist saying that he has a brain tumour. And he said the treatment is available, but not in this country. There's one chance he's got of getting out to Australia and getting the treatment paid for privately because it's not available in Britain on the NHS. And the letter was signed by some professor from Stepping Hill.
Like many others, Ray Fisher fell for the scam and agreed to help a dying man.
I was getting updated phone calls saying he needs 150, 350, then it was coming back down. Someone else had donated some, so I was getting like a running commentary on how much he needed. And I think the final amount was 30,000. So I can't run to 30, but I can run to 15. As the morning I approached him to come and pick the cheque up, it was all done over mobiles. So it's all getting harassed and busy at work. I'm getting Myatt on the landline, I'm getting Myatt on the mobile phone. He said he needs the money, he's got a plane waiting at the airport. Like an idiot, I fell for it.
Rycroft told some of his victims that he had a plane on standby and that therefore it was waiting for him and he needed the money quickly, he needed them to act quickly. And that's a classic form of what's called deadlining in con game parlance, which is a form of a hurry-up. It's a way of pressuring people into giving you the money quickly so they don't have time to have any doubts, they don't have time to think twice about things, they just have to act. And they act on the rationalisation they've already made, which is they trust you, they want to help you. So by deadlining them, you make them cough up there and then.
He said he had the airplane waiting at Manchester Airport to fly him straight off. So I didn't think there was any breathing time at all. It was just sheer pressure what he put us under.
People started actually investing into a trust where he could receive treatment to try and save his life. And it just facilitated really that deception again, and he still maintained his lifestyle because now the money wasn't coming in for the investments, it was coming in for his cancer treatment.
The new phase of the con was successfully up and running, and Rycroft again started to see the world on other people's money. People thought they were funding Rycroft in a desperate bid to save his life, sending him around the world to meet with leading cancer experts and to be treated with groundbreaking remedies. The reality was he was using the charitable donations to enjoy extravagant holidays. He would often take along his friends who believed they were supporting Rycroft through grueling treatments. They didn't know that the whole scenario was in fact a cruel, manipulative scam, and that they, like everyone else, were actually being betrayed. While abroad with friends, Glenn Rycroft was careful to never let the facade of the tragic cancer victim slip. He would disappear on the pretense that he was going to have potentially life-saving treatments, and his friends were none the wiser. He would sometimes return with physical signs that he'd undergone treatment. On one occasion he returned with a ball patch on the back of his shaved head to represent surgery. It was all a con.
To facilitate that deception, he would disappear for days on end, saying he'd go for it. The treatment, he wanted to go for it on his own, he didn't want them to put through. It was very painful treatment, etc. So he'd give them money and say, look, you look after yourself for 2 days and I'll go away. And he'd basically go and book into a motel or another hotel. Every time he went over there, he always stayed at 5-star resorts, and lived the high life.
None of Glenn Rycroft's friends wanted to speak about their experiences in this documentary.
I think in Glenn Rycroft's case, it was a combination of the financial gain, but also living that high life, and the sympathy and empathy that was being poured on him by other people was obviously irresistible as well.
The reliance on the kindness of his community would inevitably become his downfall. Back in Salford, Greater Manchester, England, the local community were taking matters into their own hands. Rycroft had underestimated their generosity and the number of people now rallying to his cause.
When he started the cancer story, basically it went out of his control then, because family and friends involved other people outside of that circle of trust that he'd created, where everything that he could say in there was believable.
By expanding the pool of his victims, he was running a big risk, because by restricting them to friends and family, he had an automatic fail-safe, if you like, which is that they're much less likely to doubt him because they trust him already, whereas outsiders are much more likely to be suspicious. And that's a general rule in con games, is that the fewer people you can involve, the better, basically.
I don't think he realised that he would get as much attention as he did get when he came up with the story that he was dying of cancer.
In order to raise money for his life-saving treatments, a benefit night was organised at the local rugby club that he used to work at. That night, in honour of Glenn Rycroft, would be the evening that exposed his web of lies and secured his downfall.
I spent a sleepless night. I mean, can you imagine? I live in a local community where everybody knows this chap, and I'm going to be the one that says, well, actually, I don't think this chap's got cancer.
Former air steward Glenn Rycroft had swindled his local community of Salford, Greater Manchester, England, out of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Firstly, by offering them the chance to invest in a fictitious British Airways bond scheme, and then by claiming he had a cancerous brain tumour.
He was very, very convincing, very, very personable guy, and consequently you would talk with him, discuss things with him, totally and completely believe in the things he was describing. And to suddenly find out that the whole thing was fraudulent, completely and utterly devastating. If you can't trust this guy, who can you trust?
But Glenn Rycroft's cancer con couldn't go on forever, and soon it was to come crashing down.
Rycroft's bubble eventually burst, and it burst on the night at the premises behind me here, the Willows. This was as a result of a charitable event that had basically been organised by his family and friends. They put a huge amount of commitment into securing variety acts who were given of the services next to nothing for no cost to anybody. And it, on the face of it, it looked like it was going to be a tremendous evening and it would raise a lot of money.
A night of entertainment, singing and fundraising, all in Rycroft's honour. But for once, Rycroft wasn't the most willing of beneficiaries, and he was keeping his distance.
He wasn't turning up for meetings. One of the organisers who was organising the variety acts, he himself was a cancer sufferer, and had tried to speak to Glenn about it to see whether he needed any counselling, any support and the like, and Rycroft was distant. He was careful not to speak to him, simply because this man would have seen straight through his ruse and his deceptions.
In another unexpected twist of fate, the compere for the night worked for British Airways, Rycroft's former employers.
A very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to Glenn Rycroft's benefit evening. All the money raised this evening was all going to a very good cause. We've got some wonderful acts on.
Debbie Henley also tried to speak to Glenn Rycroft prior to the benefit evening.
I did on several occasions try to contact him, but unfortunately I was unable to get hold of him on his mobile phone. I eventually got hold of him and he was very curt with me on the phone. I put this down to the fact that maybe he was having treatment and wasn't very well. I explained to him that my job as a compere was to get as much money on the evening as I could for him, and that we'd love to get British Airways involved. I had heard from the organisers that British Airways had given a large sum of money as for tickets, etc., as a prize for the raffle. And I said to Glenn, well, let's get hold of BA News, which is a company newspaper. British Airways employees are exceptionally generous, and let's get hold of them, get them involved and get as much money as we can. He then became very defensive and said that he didn't want British Airways News getting involved at all, and in fact he'd heard that I worked for British Airways and didn't want me comparing the evening for him at all. Again, I found it a bit odd, but put it down to the fact that he wasn't well, and I just explained to him that unfortunately I would be the lady that was doing the evening, and my job was to get as much money as I possibly could for him.
But this was just the beginning of Debbie Henley's suspicions.
On a few occasions I'd asked would Glenn be available at the rehearsal so that I could have a chat with him, see if he thought he'd be okay for the evening to come and collect his cheque, or did he want somebody else involved. And on many occasions people would tell me that Glenn wouldn't be there. He was having 2 and 3 amounts of radiotherapy per day, and unfortunately he wasn't well enough to attend the evening. On a few occasions people would say that he'd gone to have his treatment, and I'd ask, well, who's bringing him home, if family helping him, and he'd say no, he's driving himself home after the treatments because it's very upsetting for people to see him in such a state. He'd rather not upset anybody and keep it all to himself.
What basically happened was that several people involved in the organisation started to have slight concerns, not something they could specifically put the finger on.
But little things started to add up, and when I was chatting to people, different little things that, British Airways had loaned him £30,000 for treatment. Now, British Airways are a very, very generous company, and they do look after their employees wonderfully. However, they're not a charity either, that, you imagine the amount of people that do fall in a company. They couldn't do this for everybody, and it all seemed a little bit odd. We then heard that he'd been out to Australia to get life-saving treatment, and this clinic that he'd gone to did have a cure for cancer, but Glenn had to sign a contract to say that he would never divulge where this company was or the kind of treatment that he'd had. That's when alarm bells started to go, that I thought, well, whoa, there's somebody out there with a cure for cancer, and they're not sharing it with everybody.
Rycroft's cruel cancer con was about to unravel and crash down around him.
I think the final straw was when a chap came up to me, one of the organisers, and we were just chatting briefly about the evening and how it was going. And he said, British Airways are such a marvellous company, aren't they? Glenn was telling me that they've got a jet on standby to take him anywhere in the world should a cure for cancer come up. And I think that was when the penny dropped, and I thought, even the chief executive of British Airways would not have a jet on standby. It's just not on. It wouldn't happen ever. And that was when I thought, there's something not right. And it was a horrible feeling to have, that someone who's told you they've got cancer and you're thinking, maybe they haven't.
Obviously, she worked for British Airways, that British Airways would never do anything like that. And that's where really the scepticism crept in and people started asking questions. And from there it snowballed, really.
I spoke to one of the organisers at the Willows, and I said, there's just something not right here. And one of the organisers said to me, yeah, we kind of feel that, it could, that there is something untoward going on. I said, well, I'm going to have to speak to British Airways tomorrow. I spent a sleepless night. I mean, can you imagine? I live in a local community where everybody knows this chap, and I'm going to be the one that says, well, actually, I don't think this chap's got cancer. When I did finally ring British Airways and speak to them, and they told me that, Glenn no longer, because everybody in the community still presumed that Glenn worked for British Airways, that Glenn hadn't worked for the company for some months. It was just awful. It was just sickening.
Positive now of foul play, Debbie phoned the police, but with the benefit the next day, the show just had to go on.
Well, we went ahead with the evening, and when I got up on the stage to thank everybody for coming, I did explain to them we would be giving all the money that evening to Pendlebury Children's Hospital, and there were a few ums and ahs and a few people wondering, well, I've come for Glenn, but that was the only way that we could get the evening to go ahead.
It was then that the full extent of the cold-hearted con started to become clear.
When I came off the stage after the raffle, there was a queue of people waiting to speak to me. It's a small community round here. It doesn't take long for people to find out what you do for a living. And there was a lady waiting there, and she said, I believe you work for British Airways. So I said, yes, I do. She said, well, would you let me know how my shares are doing? She said, because Glenn took my money a few months ago, and I've been trying to contact him, and he's not got back to me to let me know when I'll be getting all my money. And my stomach, I could physically have been sick, because I just then thought, this is bigger than any of us thought. So I said, well, actually, I haven't any idea about your British Airways shares, but if you give me a name and address, I'll take your name and address and I'll get straight back to you. Behind her was somebody else. Behind her was somebody else. In the end, there was about 9 people queuing up to ask how their British Airways shares were doing, and I didn't have a clue. I've worked for the company for 20 years, and I certainly didn't know anything about any British Airways shares.
The whole thing just started to unwind, and once it started to unravel, it became a total nightmare. He went from being the good guy to being just unbelievably involved in any number of dirty tricks. And that really is very, very disturbing.
After the evening was over, I was back in the dressing room behind the stage, and a gentleman came to me and said, "Glenn's here and he wants to speak to his compere." To which, again, my stomach was already in knots anyway. I just went around the curtain and looked down the room, and there was a willowy figure of a man at the back with a hat on, and I just couldn't speak to him. I was just so appalled by what had gone on that evening, and I just couldn't speak to him at all. I just went back into the dressing room.
And Debbie Henley's worst fears were soon proven right.
I spoke to the management here at the Willows, and they told me that because of slight suspicions some of the organisers had been having, they had actually asked Rycroft to produce a letter from his doctor. A letter was produced, and that was presented to me when I first came to it, and it was purporting to be from a Professor Knowles of Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport. The British Medical Association told us that there was no such person as Professor Knowles, certainly not working at Stepping Hill Hospital, and certainly not involved in the field of oncology.
In fact, not only was the doctor fictitious, but Stepping Hill Hospital, Stockport, England, didn't even have a cancer department. Rycroft was arrested on suspicion of fraud by the police and interviewed.
He was told he was being arrested on suspicion of deception, and he made a full and frank admission to us there and then. Travelling back to the station, he actually suggested, quite unsolicited, that it was a pack of lies. And in the subsequent interviews that we conducted with him under caution, with the solicitor present, he fully admitted that he'd never had cancer. The British Airways investment bonds never existed. He made a complete, full and frank admission of the criminal actions that he'd carried out.
During the house search, not only did we recover these medical journals with highlighted areas in which highlighted the conditions he had, we also recovered receipts for blood capsules purchased from a joke shop, which would have been conducive with him collapsing and blood pouring from his nose and mouth, which his family witnessed.
And the word quickly spread around the community.
The next thing I find out is that there are, in actual fact, an awful lot of other people that have been in the same situation who have invested with the BA scheme. And essentially, this was a completely new and separate scam to the cancer scam that had initially caused the problems to come to light.
The whole thing's been a scam. So I didn't feel too... It didn't really sink in. I didn't feel too bothered about the money at that time. It's only when everything else comes to light and the way you think you've been deceived and manipulated, I think that's what hurt the most, being taken for the mug.
On leaving the police station, I remember quite vividly saying to him that you need to go and tell your mother and your family that you're not dying. You've got to make a clean breast of things and be honest with them. And he assured me that he would do that.
Rycroft, seemingly unable to keep his promise and face his family, in a cruel twist decided to genuinely take himself to death's door.
What he'd done, he'd gone out that night and put petrol on himself in his motor car and deliberately crashed it into the central reservation on the M62 motorway over in West Yorkshire.
Glenn Rycroft cruelly conned and manipulated his friends, his family and his local community of Salford, Greater Manchester, England. Rycroft's first con started in the year 2000. He convinced people to invest in a bogus investment scheme where he used people's life savings to fund his extravagant lifestyle. The following year, when it looked as if Rycroft was in danger of being caught, he did the unthinkable. He lied and told his nearest and dearest he was dying of cancer. In a dramatic twist, when the scam was uncovered, Rycroft seemed unable to cope with the revelation and decided to really try to end his life.
He'd been in the police station more or less all day, but that evening had jumped in his car, driven over the other side of the Pennines, and had a serious attempt to commit suicide. Doused the car with petrol, driven it into the Armco barrier, turned it over, set it on fire. A van which was following had screeched to a halt, and the guys inside it had leapt out without thought for themselves and pulled him out of the burning wreckage.
It would be easy to read that as a kind of gesture of remorse, but I'm not sure that that would be right, because given the appalling things this guy tried to pull off, he obviously didn't really have much of a conscience. I don't think remorse was in his vocabulary. So one suspects that it wasn't really to do with remorse, it was maybe more to do with panic or embarrassment, or it's just, as part of his psychopathy, it's about acting on impulse quite often.
This seemed to be his solution, rather than facing the consequences, to put an end to it. Difficult to say, but in some respects it may have been better for all of us if he had.
With the man who claimed he had cancer now lying in hospital, it was left to Detective Sergeant Steve Retford to break the news to Glenn Rycroft's family that their son and brother had never actually had cancer.
I was confronted the next day with a call, a physical call. She came to the police station of his mother and one of his sisters when they were asking what on earth Glenn had been up to. And I simply said to them, has he not explained to you? Has he not explained to you what the arrest yesterday was all about? Clearly he hadn't done. One act that any police officer, when they join the job, finds very, very difficult is delivering a death message to somebody to say that the nearest and dearest has just been killed in a road traffic collision or industrial accident or the like. I had an experience in reverse, in that I told his mother and one of his sisters that their son and brother was not going to die in several weeks' time from a brain tumour. And the reaction from his mother and his sister were similar reactions that you would say to somebody if they just lost somebody. They were absolutely distraught. They were both in tears. It took some time before they could compose themselves and I could speak to them. They thought that he was dying, and it was just a pack of lies, and they were absolutely decimated by the news, albeit good news, that he wasn't going to die. They thought he was, and this is the way that this character deceived his own family.
With Rycroft's recovery came the court case, and in December 2003, 27-year-old Glenn Rycroft stood trial in Manchester, England. Although pleading guilty to 25 of the 30 charges of deception, Glenn Rycroft refused to take responsibility for his actions and the devastation he had caused. Instead, he turned the tables on his community and claimed that his actions were as a result of being brainwashed by a local cult called the Community of Free Spirits.
He claims that he'd been manipulated by a local cult group run by a neighbour of his for many years, since in fact he was a small child.
Rycroft's shocking and disturbing claims that he had been abused and controlled from a young age by a neighbour were fully investigated by the police, and once again his words were found to be nothing more than malicious and vicious lies.
The fact that he came up with this explanations in court saying that he'd been influenced by a cult was just the last in a whole long line of lies. It was yet another lie, thinking on his feet to try and get himself out of his situation.
But it certainly sounds in keeping with the pattern of a psychopath or a sociopath, which is what you might call confabulation, which is when you make up stories, but really on the spur of the moment. You're just improvising as you go along. And it does sound like the desperate last throw of the dice of a cornered con man is to try and pull yet another con, basically, and some more sleight of hand to say, oh, actually, all along, it wasn't what it seemed, it was something else altogether. And so, in a way, he was trying to pull his biggest con.
I think the fact that the judge threw it out meant that he had truly been exposed for what he was, and nobody was prepared to believe anything he said anymore.
It was the end of the road for Glenn Rycroft and his emotionally manipulative lies. His dramatic and unfounded claims of an inexplicable cult controlling his every whim were rejected by the judge, and the callous cancer con man received a custodial sentence.
At the trial, Glenn Rycroft pleaded guilty to 25 counts of deception and received a 4-year sentence, which is a good sentence for deception offences. And I think the reason for that is because of the damage it done to charitable organisations within the Salford community.
The judge described Glenn Rycroft as a mean, wicked and heartless con man. It is estimated he made £200,000 from his deceptions.
We lost 10,000 in cash. The rest of it is money that was set up to be made, which effectively vanished in the haze.
Minimal money was ever recovered because of the lifestyle he had. He was basically, he was living a millionaire's lifestyle, flying out to any destination he wanted to, when he wanted to, and renting a flat that cost thousands of pounds a month anyway.
I think the biggest loss by an individual victim was just over £50,000. Collectively, it was between £200,000 and £250,000. So in the bigger picture of things, you might say that there are con men around who've secured far in excess of that. I would agree with that. But what I would agree, where Rycroft is right up there with the cruelest and biggest con men, is the fact that it's the scams that he used. To tell somebody, your nearest and dearest, that you are dying of cancer and have got limited weeks, months to live, when it's a complete pack of lies, it says a lot about the individual.
I think the reason that cancer was used as a scam was because nobody would question it. It's one of those taboo subjects that you could never believe that anybody would wish it on themselves or even pretend that they had it. It's one of those areas that nobody would ever question, and I think that is why he got away with it for as long as he did.
The community fell for it. His immediate family, his parents, his brothers, his sisters, his in-laws, his best friends, all fell for it. And that's why they all of them were victims of Glenn Rycroft, really. And Salford was a victim at the end of it, because it's obviously harmed Salford in relation to future charity events.
Glenn Rycroft served 2 of his 4-year sentence and has returned to Salford in England, a community that will never be the same after Rycroft's merciless manipulation of their charity and their goodwill.
The damage he'd done in the Salford community, it created distrust in the community of any events that were coming up in the future. It would take a long time for that trust to come back. It made them people who are all investing in it very sceptical in the future, investing in it again. So quite a substantial amount of damage I feel it'd done.
As a community, the people were just absolutely gutted, especially business people who had, invested or given money thinking that he was dying of cancer. There was an element of embarrassment, there was anger, there was upset, especially for the people that he was very close to, that he'd conned, and almost the relief that, thank God he's not got cancer, but oh my God, how has he done this to us? Why has he been able to do this? How has he been able to get away with this? That's the big question I think everybody was asking. And I think some people, including myself, felt quite foolish. And they shouldn't feel foolish at all, because, the nature is that they did feel sorry and they wanted to help.
Put me off making donations to anybody else. Still do little bits for charity and that, but I don't do anything as substantial as that.
Glenn Rycroft still adamantly claims that his actions were the result of years of indoctrination into a secret cult within his community. A cult which no one has been able to find any evidence of. Like the judge who sentenced Rycroft to prison, most people are now certain that Rycroft is indeed a cruel, callous con man.
He's hurt me, he's hurt my family, and he's hurt an awful lot of other people as well.
Without doubt, one of the biggest con men I've ever come across, because and the stories that he elaborated during the course of the investigation were unbelievable, and as I said, still amazes me to this day. But I think he's one of the people who, he's shown no remorse whatsoever for what he's done, and thinks still he's done the right thing.
And I could certainly well do without ever meeting anybody like that again.
In terms of 20th century art fraud, John Drew and the John Myatt case must rank right at the top.
But the problem was we were being scanned by a very intelligent person on multi-levels.
Unbelievable that people would be looking at paintings painted in the same kind of stuff that you put on your walls, basically, and authenticating them.
If I had been a dealer, I'd have most certainly been fooled.
The sophistication and intricacy of this incredible scam saw forgeries of famous artists such as Ben Nicholson and Alberto Giacometti, painted in emulsion and covered in tea, coffee and hoover dust, audaciously passed off as original oil paintings under the art world's noses. The con was masterminded by a cool and calculating criminal with an IQ of 165 whose name was John Drew. He enticed struggling, cash-strapped single-parent John Myatt into his intricate and almost foolproof scam.
John Drew has got a huge amount of, for want of another word, front.
But he's very, very dangerous because he's a fantasist. He's quite happy to scam money out of anybody.
But there must be an element of intellectual one-upmanship.
And putting one over on people who probably thought themselves to be very smart. And he probably thought, you know, that he'd made them look like idiots, and that made him feel great.
Mastermind John Drew took the art con to a whole new level. His masterstroke was the infiltration of the British art archives. He secured access, then simply rewrote history to authenticate his bogus paintings. This shocked the art world to its core.
Basically, it's art historical revisionism. So he's changing history, he's changing art history.
He went to enormous lengths to authenticate the pictures and to change the authenticity of them and the invoice that goes around with them in order to make those paintings believable. And the idea of taking on the art world and of all these superior intellects and to actually get the better of them must have been irresistible to him.
How the hell we ever got away with it, I just don't know.
The story of what has been dubbed the greatest contemporary art fraud of the 20th century begins in the unlikeliest of places. Here in leafy Stafford, England, back in the mid-1980s, over 200 paintings would be forged by a cash-strapped single parent called John Myatt. Myatt's intentions began honourably enough. A single parent raising his family, he decided to try to earn money to support his 2 young children while working at home. He placed an advertisement in the UK magazine Private Eye offering his services as an artist who reproduced copies of famous paintings.
The advert said, genuine fakes, 19th and 20th century paintings from £150. The first time I put it in, and the second time I put it in, it said 19th and 20th century paintings from £250. What were the prices up a bit? I think it was about a year and a half into it when I got a phone call from Mr. Drew. And the only difference between any other customer and Mr. Drew was that he just kept on coming back.
John Drew, a man with a brilliant mind and an IQ of 165, was born John Cockett. Throughout his life, he worked in jobs he wasn't legitimately qualified for, but always convinced his employers otherwise.
Drew did have all the hallmarks of a really good con man. He was utterly believable and plausible. He could tell extremely complicated lies and keep those lies going, remembering everything he'd told.
He taught physics, A-level, at a school in North London. And I don't think he has, I think he's got physics O-level. And the irony of this is that he actually taught it quite well.
John Drew showed very clearly from early on that his dislike of authority. He didn't like working for anybody else. He wanted to work for himself. He was clearly arrogant in that respect.
I mean, it sounds as though Drew was so sure of himself and so convinced of his own superiority, which was backed up, I suppose, if you like, by the fact that he was successful. For him, that was evidence that he was a cut above everyone else, that he was a few steps ahead.
When he contacted John Myatt, Drew, now in his 30s, was masquerading as a professor of nuclear physics who needed paintings to decorate his home. In reality, he was a master con man, preparing the ground to lure in the man who would be the key to the next scam he was planning.
He was one of the most exciting people I'd ever met. He was so interesting. It was a bit like going to the movies, really, seeing John Drew every 3 weeks or so. As time went by, I got to know him better. I stopped meeting him in Euston Station, and I used to meet him in Golders Green Station, and then he'd take me to his house, and we'd have a meal, and I'd meet his children, I'd meet his wife, and the only thing I think I remember him saying, well, this is a long time ago, of course, I think he said, don't tell my wife that you painted these, will you? You know, I'm just telling her that you're an art expert who's come to look over the paintings and stuff. When you bear in mind that most customers were good for about 2 paintings, this was really quite exceptional, this man. And in the end, he seemed to just run out of ideas, and he said, well, what would you like to do next, John, you know, to me? So I looked through and found some drawings, cubist drawings, and it struck me that I could turn these into paintings, you know, not just copying something, which is just stupid, you know, but actually creating something new from a drawing. And I remember it was in a little oval thing about that big, maybe. And painted this painting. It was by a German cubist that very few people had heard of, called Albert Glaze.
It was after this, the 9th commission, the painting in the style of the little-known cubist artist Albert Glazes, that John Myatt received a phone call from his best customer. A phone call from John Drew that would change Myatt's life forever and turn an innocent hobby into a devious and criminal life of dishonesty.
The phone rang and he said, do you know that Albert Glaze painting that I bought off you? And I've taken it into Christie's and they say it's a very interesting work and they'll sell it for £25,000. So, you know, would you rather have 250 or would you like 12,500? You know, with hindsight, that was where I made my mistake.
Drew was very clever in the way that he targeted Myatt and built up a genuine relationship of trust with him. He paid him a relatively normal sum of money for the copies that he was making, and they built up a relationship together. It wasn't till that moment where he offered him £12,500 for the painting and sucked him into the con and used Myatt's weaknesses that the whole relationship and the con really started.
So he made him an offer he couldn't refuse, effectively. And then once Myatt had done this deal with the devil, if you like, he was already implicated, and it was probably a lot harder for him to back out.
I should have said, oh, come on, you know, this is painted in emulsion paint. You know, I haven't used original oil paints, it's not on it. None of the materials are original anyway. It's a crime, you know, you don't do that kind of stuff. But, I don't know, something in me just sort of went... And I thought, yeah, that's good, that is. I like the idea of 12,500. I've never seen £12,500 in an envelope. I've never seen that kind of money. And I got all excited about having all this money. I wasn't selling it to anybody. I mean, as far as, you know, I didn't have anything to do with walking into Sotheby's or anything. I was just painting them. So I suppose, you know, it was turning a blind eye with a vengeance to what was really going on.
I think it's easy to feel that maybe this is a victimless crime because art theft is, you know, a very affluent area. People can afford to lose a few paintings here and there. But there are 2 areas where it really is very damaging. Firstly, on an individual who's paid a lot of money and put a lot of trust in an expert and believes they're getting something, you know, very valuable for their money. And secondly, the impact on the art world itself. You know, there will be enormous distrust now on the provenances of these paintings and of any paintings because of the effect of what John Drew has done.
The classic con artist thinks that it is a victimless crime, and they often rationalise what they've done as saying they haven't really done a crime and nobody's got hurt. And it's easy to think that way, especially if you're scamming rich people or businesses, for instance. It's quite easy to portray it as a victimless crime because you could say, well, you know, they could afford it or their insurance would cover it.
Myatt's fateful decision was one he regrets to this day. Tempted by the prospect of accumulating vast wealth, Myatt agreed to Drew's proposal. They were now partners in crime. Little did Myatt know the enormity of the scale of the scam which was to come, and the terrible price he would eventually have to pay. But now he was hooked in. There was no going back.
It started there. If it had stopped there, of course, I don't think, you know, I'd be talking to you now or be talking to anybody else about it.
For almost 10 years, conman John Drew fooled the art world with a complex and intricate scam, passing off fake paintings as famous artists' work. It was a con of such magnitude and importance that the art world is still reeling from the blow.
John John Drew was a very clever man. I mean, he'd had an IQ of 165, and he created a very elaborate scam which showed an awful lot of depth of knowledge about the subject matter he was going into, which he wouldn't have had before.
He had access to the best art bookshops in the country, and if there was an artist who particularly interested him for whatever reason, then he'd buy an art book and he'd turn down the page and say, no, this is interesting, why don't you look at that, and that kind of thing.
Drew's con would never have been possible if he had not courted and enlisted the help of artist John Myatt. Before the scam, Myatt was making a modest living selling honest copies of art classics legitimately. But when Christie's paid Drew £25,000 for one of Myatt's fake paintings, believing it to be genuine, Myatt found the sum of £12,500 just too tempting. He became part of Drew's scam, painting new fakes of master artists for Drew to sell on as the real deal.
I thought it was just exciting and fun and unbelievable that people would be looking at paintings painted in the same kind of stuff that you put on your walls, basically, and authenticating them. I didn't use aged canvas. I didn't use authentic materials. I used KY jelly, which is water-based, to actually dilute the paint if I needed a thin glaze.
But the thing is, about household emulsion paint, it dries very quickly. If you varnish over it, and he didn't always do the varnishing himself. We believe Drew did some of the varnishing. If you varnish over it, it's very difficult, even for an art restorer, to know whether it's a real oil painting or something totally different.
The way the paintings actually got treated after they left me was so, I mean, they were walked all over and there was Hoover dust emptied all over them, and occasionally, I mean, I would throw coffee and tea at a painting, and just grind it into the surface of the canvas.
Allegedly, we heard from John Myatt that John Drew would empty the contents of his Hoover onto the painting and then varnish over it. Or maybe he did that when the varnish was still wet. He would scuff the frames.
And the other thing that's worth mentioning is the difference between a fake and a forgery. If you're doing a forgery, there really has to be a lot of thought gone into the back of the painting, what the painting looks like from the back. A lot of people know what paintings look like from the front, but they're not quite so clear about, what happens when you turn them the other way around. So that was another of, John Drew covered that as well. He would take the painting and sort of disassemble it, put new stretchers on it, gallery stickers, signatures and all this kind of thing on the back of the painting.
But the paintings were only one element of the con. In a masterstroke of cunning, Drew painstakingly ensured the legitimacy of the fake paintings were never questioned.
The way he wanted to take it, you had to provide the paintings with a history, with what they call a provenance, which is pretty much the same as a service history with your car, stamps in the book and all the rest of it. And he made it his job to do that.
The point about authenticating a painting is the first and most important thing is looking at the picture and judging the paint, the calligraphy of the way the brushstrokes are put on, and the colour balance, etc., with authenticated works by the artist. The second most important thing, which is very important, if the picture has provenance, histories of previous owners, especially if it takes you back to the artist, and also exhibitions the picture's been in. So provenance is very important.
And if you've got the provenances there, and the provenances were very, very professional, I've never seen anything like it. If I had been a dealer, I'd have most certainly been fooled.
And to make the scam work, John Drew presented himself as a darling of the art world.
John Drew gave a donation of £20,000 to the Tate, and as a result of that, he was naturally thought of as a supporter of the arts. And he said he was interested in looking up the old archives, which he did in the Tate, and he set to work. A very busy little bee. To my knowledge, the type of forgery of archival material has never been done to this extent with paintings, and not on such a scale, and not so audacious, because this was full penetration of the Tate archives and the V&A archives and a number of other archives as well.
He would fabricate catalogues of exhibitions by taking a catalogue out of an archive. inserting one of my new paintings into the catalogue, returning it to the archive, and then a researcher will say, oh yes, well, you know, that was obviously exhibited in 1965 in Brighton Art Gallery or something, and that is the history of it, which validates the painting. However poor the quality.
In retrospect, John Myatt's painting is not good at all. But the problem was we were being scanned by a very intelligent person on multi-levels.
You know, I was on a learning curve here. I hadn't done this before. You know, okay, some of the paintings were good, but some of them were absolutely awful. I mean, really bad quality. How the hell we ever got away with it, I just don't know.
The problem was that people were no longer looking at the artwork, they were looking at the provenances.
These paintings came to us with authentication certificates from living experts who were the #1 experts on the artists, and authentication all the way back. So in other words, your brains are being scrambled. You're saying, wait a minute, it's been authenticated, and you're looking at it through rose-tinted spectacles that you wouldn't normally be doing.
It's there in black and white, you're painting in a book. It's almost 100% genuine.
Drew had devised the almost perfect con. Never before had the archives been tampered with in such a comprehensive way that ensured even leading experts accepted practically worthless forgeries for the works of renowned artists, leading them to be sold for thousands of pounds each. The paintings were being sold through all the major Mayfair auction houses in London, England, as well as Christie's and Sotheby's. Most paintings were sold for between £10,000 and £30,000, whereas others fetched £100,000. One of Myatt's Giacomettis sold at auction in New York, USA for £300,000, over £150,000 for a painting that took John Myatt just 5 hours. Another of Myatt's paintings, this time a Ben Nicholson, is alleged to have also sold in the USA for £105,000.
It was pretty unbelievable, you know, when John Drew said that he'd taken such and such a painting to a world expert and this person had authenticated the paintings. I just thought it was just absurd. But, I mean, funny almost. Yeah, I mean, you have to laugh, don't you? I do find it hard to laugh sometimes because there's such vast amounts of money involved in all this, but, you know, some of these people just don't know what they're talking about.
If somebody wants to scam you and take money off you and has really worked out how to do it, they probably will, whether they're a brilliant salesman or something else.
The scale of the scam was unprecedented, and the art world was none the wiser for now.
It covered a whole spectrum of artists, mainly modern British, but in all we reckoned he'd done about 200.
And with so many paintings to handle, Drew had to evade suspicion by involving other people, who were none the wiser to the con.
What happened was that John Drew set up a number of runners to go to all the auction houses.
It was no good him going in every time, you know, the same face saying, oh, here's another painting, that he had to recruit a group of people who didn't know that these paintings were fakes at all. In the end, I think he told them that he represented a consortium of art collectors.
The first picture I bought from Drew's stooge was part of a group that Christie's had sold for a lot of money, and I got it authenticated by Christie's. It cost me about £5,500. That represents a total loss to me.
I'm sure money always plays a huge part in all of these cons. People wouldn't do it if there was no money involved. Most of the time, in my experience, money is a very, very large factor. But there must be an element of intellectual one-upmanship.
And I think that was probably one of his main motivating factors. It probably wasn't money, it was probably getting a thrill out of it, getting a buzz out of successfully pulling off his con, and putting one over on people who probably thought themselves to be very smart. And he probably thought, you know, that he'd made them look like idiots, and that made him feel great. The classic characteristic of a con man is this need to feel that you are better than the average Joe, basically, than Joe Schmo on the street. You're a step ahead, you don't have to work for a living, like all those other schmoes, you don't have to punch in and punch out. And you're not some lowly criminal either, you know, you're not using violence, you're not breaking and entering, you're not even doing real crime, you're just using your wits, and you're clever than the other guy. It's kind of circular logic. Because they weren't able to guard themselves against it, because they fell for it, therefore they had it coming, therefore it served them right. And that's the kind of twisted psychology that really goes on a lot in the con artist's mind.
I think he was a superb con man. I think he was able to persuade other people that he knew their area of expertise. If he was talking to a GP, he would persuade the GP that he knew something about medicine. If he was talking to a tax accountant, the tax accountant would say, this is a man who knows about complicated tax law. He was just very gifted, in like a chameleon in a way. He'd be what you wanted him to be.
I mean, perversely, this con obviously required all the sort of hard work and intelligence that would make someone a success in you know, straight life, if you like, in non-criminal life. And so it's kind of perverse that these characteristics, these attributes, if you like, should be put to such devious ends.
John Drew really loved it. He loved the con, wanted to do it over and over again. It wasn't that the money wasn't important to him, because I'm sure it was. I mean, it obviously was very important to him, but there was another thing to it as well. It was looking at the important people in the art world and just knowing something that they didn't. And so it led him into the mistake of doing it over and over and over again. And of course, the more you do these kind of things, the more likely you are to get caught.
The con was fully and successfully operational, but not all of the art world was absolutely convinced, and Myatt and Drew's intricate scam was dramatically about to come unravelled. Peter Nahum, an art dealer in London, England, became suspicious when he was offered a second Ben Nicholson painting.
We looked at this picture in detail. Ben Nicholson has a certain handwriting. They were beautifully signed in pencil, as he does on the back. They had these labels, they had the authentication, etc. And suddenly the penny dropped. That this had exactly the same labels from a completely different source, the same gallery labels from the 1950s as the other one. And the chances of you looking at two Ben Nicholsons and being offered them for completely different sources, with completely different provenances, having been in the same two exhibitions, are very, very unlikely, because these weren't major exhibitions, these were minor dealers' exhibitions. Then we started analysing the signature, and when you really looked at it, it started falling apart. Just wasn't quite right. And at this point, suddenly all that information came together, and I called in the head of the antique squad.
But Peter Nahum wasn't the only person who was suspicious. The cracks in Myatt and Drew's con were beginning to show.
There was another source in France, the Giacometti Institute, from Mary Lisa Palmer, who had one of the new debuts and suspected a number of other Giacomettis as being fake.
Giacometti was a Swiss-Italian artist who moved to Paris, France in 1922. The Giacometti Institute in Paris is responsible, among other things, for cataloguing the artist's work as well as uncovering and stopping would-be forgers. Mary Lisa Palmer, the director of the Giacometti Association, had been sent a catalogue by Sotheby's in the UK featuring a Giacometti standing nude. She instantly questioned its authenticity.
The painting that I saw was inconsistent. Like, the head looked like a man's head on a woman's body, the background was poor, the strokes were wishy-washy. When an artist paints, there's a lot of energy that goes into the painting. When a person copies, he's copying the work of somebody else. It's not at all the same energy in the painting itself.
The Giacomettis were so bad in quality that it didn't take anybody from the Giacometti Foundation to see that they were rubbish. I could see that they were rubbish immediately.
Then it was signed also, and the signature resembled other fake signatures and not the real signature. When Alberto Giacometti used to sign, he would sign quickly, to get rid of it. He didn't like to sign paintings or drawings, so he did it quickly. This signature is very applied, so copied. So I went to London to look at the work. I looked at the front of the canvas, the back of the canvas. I asked for an x-ray. Then I told the people at Sotheby's that I thought it was a fake. And then they told me, but there are experts that think that it's okay. And you will find documents at the Tate Gallery proving the provenance is being correct.
Because he'd been so thorough with his paperwork and created this history for them, people thought, oh, well, it must be good because this was exhibited in 1968 or 1961, was it? And such, here's the paperwork to prove it.
So I went to the Tate Gallery to look at these documents. I did see a photograph of this painting slipped into the Tate Gallery archives, and from that moment on, I felt that they were being tampered with. Basically, if the painting was fake, then the provenance had to be fake.
Mary Lisa Palmer now had to try and prove that the catalogues were bogus.
Well, I sort of had to play the detective part because people would not believe that the provenance were fake because they were very well done, quote unquote. I had to try to prove that the paper was not from the 50s, so I had to look at the watermarks and contact the paper companies. I had to check with the libraries whether this catalog was in their archives. I had to write to the printers to see if they printed the catalog. I had to check with another foundation whether they had received the same provenance material. And I found out that they had a different date for the same catalog. I also wrote to the post office in England to see if the stamps were used in the 50s. I went on and on and on in this sort of detail.
That sort of detail resulted in Mary Lisa Palmer's success. Experts confirmed that the paper used in the suspected fake catalogues was not from the 1950s, as they stated. She now had evidence that the provenance was corrupt.
She came over to London almost immediately with a huge amount of documentation and photographs of not only the genuine ones, but the fakes, which she reckoned matched up. And we then got our heads together, and she helped police tremendously.
The net was tightening around the con men, but in an unexpected twist, the unequivocal proof of the con would come from the unlikeliest of sources, and Drew and Myatt's scam was to be dramatically blown apart.
And that's one of the sad aspects of a con man's life. You can't afford to trust anyone.
For 8 years, John Myatt and John Drew colluded to achieve what has been dubbed the greatest art fraud of the 20th century. The duo had no idea that suspicions were being roused within the art world, but forger John Myatt was becoming less and less comfortable with his partner in crime, John Drew, and their joint deception.
I was certain that it was going to end in, tears. It was just a matter of, when.
As the con went on, the web of lies was obviously very complicated, but John Drew had to sort of really fantasize and put himself in the reality of it, and to him it was real. These paintings were genuine paintings.
I remember on one occasion in an Italian restaurant, he was going on about a painting. I said, "Oh, come on, John, just shut up for a minute. I painted these paintings, they're fakes." Off he goes. He said, no, so you're wrong. No, these are not fakes. I believe these are original paintings. And that was what he did. I guess that's the secret of being a success in that, conning department, is part of you has to sell to yourself, across from the left side to the right side of the brain or something, has to persuade yourself that these are authentic paintings, and then you can be credible.
The way that Drew talked about how these weren't fakes, they were real artworks, is maybe indicative that he was an example of what psychologists call fantasy-prone personality. Now, fantasy-prone personality is someone who has trouble differentiating between fact and fantasy, and that he literally was not very good at telling the difference between his lies and the truth, and therefore came to believe that his lies were the truth, which of course would have made him a much more effective con man.
I became more and more convinced we were going to get caught. So I backed off in the end, and I had a period of about a year. It was a lovely year. It was 1994 to 1995, so I remember rightly. And it was like when you've been washed out to sea and you turn around and you swim, and and you suddenly put your feet down, and there's the sand, and you can actually walk back to the shore again. You think, right, that's that now. That's all behind me. This is the rest of my life ahead of me. And I thought, no one will ever. I've got away with it. No one will ever know. It's done. But in London, things were happening that I didn't know anything about, and things were going on, and police were asking questions, and dealers were saying, I'm not sure about this painting, and so forth.
By 1995, John Myatt had fully removed himself from the con and stopped working with John Drew. But the art world and the police were gathering evidence and getting closer to catching the con artists who had created an estimated 200 paintings and doctored the UK's leading archives to make them seem legitimate. In a dramatic and blindside twist, Myatt and Drew's fates were sealed by an extraordinary blow from an unexpected source. John Drew's common-law wife, Bathsheba Goudsmith.
Bathsheba was falling out with John big time, and in the end he was leaving home and he left all the paperwork behind him, and she just crates it all up in a big plastic bag, gets in the back of her Mercedes and chucks it on the desk in some police station in Golders Green and says, "Now you lot," she says, "I know that there's something dodgy going on here."
It's interesting that the way that he finally got rumbled was because his common-law wife shocked him. Because one of the first rules of being a con man is don't get attached. And the more other people are involved in your con, the more chances are that something will go wrong. And that's one of the sad aspects of a con man's life. He can't afford to trust anyone, and therefore really needs, if he's going to be successful, needs to go through life as a kind of a loner. But of course, what proved to be this guy's Achilles heel was his love interest.
And she gave us a dustbin liner full of provenances, small negatives, photographs, an enormous quantity of paper and Xerox sheets of paintings. This was a huge jigsaw puzzle, which I sorted out at the Organised Crime Squad in the following weeks.
The raft of evidence presented by Drew's ex-partner, alongside the information provided by the likes of art experts Peter Nahum and Mary Lisa Palmer, created a chain reaction that unearthed further damning evidence when the police finally made their move one autumn morning in Stafford, England.
The paperwork pointed to John Myatt as being the perpetrator, so a team went up to Stafford to turn him over.
I'm lying in bed about 6 o'clock, and there's a big bang on the door, and I open the bedroom window and look down. There's about 10 people standing in the path down, and a guy holds up this thing and he says, "My name is Jonathan Searle, I'm from the Scotland Yard Arts and Antiques Squad."
When I went into his house, I saw a beautiful little drawing that he had done of his son with telephone numbers and the rest of it scribbled over it. And I knew at once that we got somebody who could draw beautifully. If you can draw well, you can paint. Then I looked up the stairs and I saw Giacometti hanging on the wall. So we were in. We knew exactly that this was our man.
And I knew then, just then, that part of my life, those 12 months where I'd been, living in Cloud Cuckoo Land, really, it really was Cloud Cuckoo Land, and this was reality coming to bite me up the backside with a vengeance.
He was very, very reasonable and obviously a bit shocked.
It was horrible. I hated it. But you could tell from the questions that they were asking that they knew more about me than I did. And perhaps not, that's not true. They knew more about John Drew than I did, obviously.
The evidence was piling up, but the real gift came from Myatt's own hand.
They were interviewing me in the interview room in Stafford Police Station, and somebody came in with this briefcase and put this letter on the table and said, "What's this then?" And it was one of those letters I'd written to John Drew about 3 years previously when I was just getting ready to part company with him, really, and it said, "Dear John, I don't like what we're doing. You can carry on doing it if you want to, but for me, that's the end of it. No hard feelings. I'm not going to say anything. Yours sincerely, John Myatt." The letter was really a gift to the police because it was just saying, "I'm guilty."
It was a very important letter, in fact. It gave us the state, the psychological state of John Myatt. And it just showed he had been suckered into this. It made us as police officers realise who was doing what behind the forgery. So it was quite helpful. And also, in John Myatt's house, we found a whole library of art books, all of which, when you look through them, they had the pages turned over on the type of painting that John Drew wanted him to do.
But, looking back on it, there were so many slipshod things that the police were able to pick up on. There was me using, for goodness sake, using emulsion paint. It's just so stupid, isn't it? It is like stupid. But there's that. There's John's kind of hundreds of little silly things he was doing and the provenances and using the wrong typewriter. And I think he signed a work in biro 2 years before biro had been invented, or something like that. It's amazing that it was as successful as it was. It was kind of amateur hour, kind of a criminal operation. But it was just successful for a long time. I don't believe it. I don't believe it now. I think it was one of the daftest things that ever happened.
With so much evidence already gathered, John Myatt decided to cooperate with the police.
I said, right, hands up. It was just the better thing to do. I felt better with it. And in a way, you were helping to undo some of the harm, that had been done.
The game was up. With Myatt's honesty, the case strengthened further. After passing off over 200 fake paintings and repeated corruption of the archives at the Tate and the V&A in London, England, the police finally arrested John Drew.
We found him as to be a very charming, affable, intelligent, highly intelligent man with a very high IQ, very, very good memory, and we found difficulty in believing virtually anything he said. We found a number of forged provenances, and he denied the whole lot. Well, he said they were genuine, and he went through court saying the whole lot were genuine. And in fact, he said the whole lot were not only were they genuine, despite the forensic evidence, despite the evidence of all the witnesses. Not only that, he said it was an MI5 plot, which is real boys' own stuff. Absolute nonsense.
With Drew and Myatt charged, the courtroom beckoned. But Drew didn't seem ready for his day in the dock.
We went through the whole palaver of going to magistrates' court, and John would come into magistrates' court, and as he would sort of pretend to have a heart attack. And then they'd have to adjourn the case, and 6 months later we'd be back in the magistrates' court, and he'd have another heart attack in the foyer, and off he'd go. So it took 3 magistrates' court hearings before the magistrate said, look, if he has to come in a stretcher, get him in.
So after several false starts, Myatt and Drew headed to the Crown Court.
And eventually got to Southwark Crown Court. And I knew what I was going to do. I was going to plead guilty, and that was that. And it was the best thing to do. I was guilty, so couldn't see much point in trying to, get my way out of it.
Despite Myatt's guilty plea, Drew pleaded not guilty, and 2 days into the trial, John Drew sacked his legal representation and opted to defend himself in court with no legal counsel.
I think the fact that Drew elected to represent himself does tell us a lot about his psychology, because it seems to me like a classic instance of the sociopathic con man who thinks that he is cleverer than everybody else, who thinks that he's better than everybody else, who thinks he doesn't need to bother with all the sort of apparatus of the state, he doesn't need a solicitor or a court-appointed lawyer or anything like that, that he can do a better job than any of them. It's a classic example of how deluded he was, I suppose.
He defended himself very ably. As I say, he has a very, very good mind, very retentive memory. But in court, he gave his qualifications as being this professor, where we tried very, very hard to find out exactly where he'd got his qualifications from. The last thing we were told, it was in Germany somewhere. And so I don't know how much of it is true, how much of it is not true.
The fact that he represented himself in court shows, again, a complete arrogance and disdain for authority. He didn't feel that anybody else was capable of representing him.
In a brazen show of arrogance, John Drew cross-examined representatives of the art world that he himself had attempted to con.
I was asked to be a witness in court. And as Mr. Drew esteemed that he didn't need a lawyer, he did the questioning. And it was quite funny. At one point, he was asking me a certain question about a certain work, and he was mixing up all his works, and I had to correct him on that.
Part of the reason that he was able to pull off this scam, or even attempt it in the first place, is because he thought he was cleverer than everybody else. But of course, that in itself was the seed of his downfall, if you like. Because he thought he was cleverer than everyone else, he stopped being careful enough and allowed himself to get tripped up.
I was a witness at his trial, which was rather surreal, that since Drew didn't have a lawyer, he was defending himself and being cross-questioned by the man who I had put there, or was one of the people who had put there, was quite a strange experience. He did ask me some questions about authenticity. I think he was trying to show that I wasn't a very good expert and I didn't know what I was doing. But when I got down from the witness box, I heard the Crown prosecution lawyer say, "Oh well, Drew didn't get anywhere with that witness then."
After a £4 million court case lasting almost 6 months, the jury were adjourned to decide the verdict on the case dubbed the greatest art fraud of the 20th century. For 8 years, John Myatt and John Drew duped the art world out of an extortionate amount of money, selling fake paintings as rediscovered classics. In 1998, the law had finally caught up with them, and the media described their scam as the biggest art fraud of the century.
To my knowledge, it was by far the largest art fraud of the 20th century in ambition and scope and in expertise, not just covering the amount of artists, but the whole way it was perpetrated.
So yes, they produced a scam which was taken to a further degree than the other fakers. In other words, giving the Tate Gallery a lot of money, becoming a patron, becoming a darling of the archives of the Tate, going in there, nicking stuff out of the Victoria and Albert Museum, creating fakes. Of course, he did a brilliant, elaborate scam.
This con was very unique insofar as that the forgers themselves were well done, the actual painting was well done, the backup system for everything on the provenancing was brilliant, and the infiltration into the archives was very, very professional. John Drew has got a huge amount of, for want of another word, front.
After almost 6 months in court, the verdict was imminent for the con artists who had fooled the art world.
Well, I was strolling around in Southwark Crown Court and people were sort of outside taking bets on how long, I was going to get. And someone said, "Oh, you'll get 6 years. This is too big, you'll get 7 years for this." And I thought, "Oh, God, what am I going to do with my children? And what a fool I've been." And, you're beating yourself up and all that. Anyway, I got a year.
Forger turned prosecution witness Myatt had done himself a favour and received 12 months for his role in the scam. Mastermind John Drew, however, was sentenced to 6 years in prison.
In terms of finance, we've never fully recovered the amount of money that John Drew must have made out of this. I don't know whether there are other artists involved. I don't know. From John Myatt's side of things, 200 paintings, most of them at the lower end. The maths of it are up for conjecture. John Myatt himself, we do know how much money he made. And it wasn't, at the end of the day, all that much.
As far as making money was concerned, the amount of money I made early on. As the thing progressed, I made less and less money out of it. If I'd stayed in teaching over the 6-year period, I think I was getting around about £12,000 a year as a teacher at that point. 12 and a half maybe, I would have made roughly the same amount of money as a supply teacher as I did as a criminal. But he evidently made £1.5 million. So you hear.
The money John Drew made from the scam remains a mystery. The press speculated that John Drew has pocketed between £1 and £2 million. John Drew has secured a position as one of Britain's most audacious and notorious con men. He served 2 years of his 6-year sentence and has yet to re-offend. John Myatt served 2 months of his sentence and is now back to painting fakes. Only these days, John Myatt fakes are openly hanging in galleries up and down the UK. Having gone straight, Myatt is now selling his paintings legitimately in his own exhibitions.
The main difference between the paintings here and the ones I did for John Drew is what's on the back of them, and that is my name and genuine fakes. It feels good to have my signature on these paintings. It feels honourable, honest, and the paintings are exactly what they say they are.
And, now legitimate, John Myatt has found customers in the unlikeliest of places.
My first ever customer really was the man who arrested me, and then the barristers who ran the case also became customers. And about 6 months ago, the foreman of the jury turned up and he said he'd like a painting as well. That's very nice. I like that. I'm so pleased that I've left all that horrible criminal stuff behind, and I've been lucky enough I'm lucky enough to have had a second chance. That's what it comes down to. And if you do get a second chance, then the best thing is not to screw up again.
The investigation may now be closed, but the repercussions of this art con can still be felt today.
The problem with this entire case is that it puts in question a number of archives.
But the problem is that now archives have been infiltrated and polluted.
It seems to me that John Drew has most of the traits of the classic con man. He seems like an absolute archetypal classic con man, because he's obviously quite a sort of smooth operator. He's obviously very convincing. He's obviously quite happy to move in high society for many years without fear of being detected. They keep pulling this scam, which is an audacious scam, without any fear of being detected. And he's obviously adaptable and resourceful. He's clever when he needs to be. He can even do some hard work when he needs to do. So this guy obviously is really a very good con man.
John Drew is a very intelligent man. As far as we can see, he's dangerous because he lives in a Walter Mitter dreamland, and therefore it's very hard to discipline people like that. People who know they've done wrong might or might not do it in the future. Somebody who lives in La La Land, we have a problem with, but he's a very intelligent man.
We recovered 73 out of 200 of John Myatt. I don't know how many others, if there were any, that John Drew did. I have no idea at all.
They can be anywhere. They can be in Japan, the United States, in Europe, just anywhere.
No one knows which walls the unrecovered fakes by these astounding con artists hang on today, completely undetected. Who knows? Maybe even yours.
Paul Bint is a travelling serial con man.
He is a 41-year-old man who has been appearing before the courts from the age of 16. He's a man who lives in a fantasy world.
The sort of people that Paul Bint impersonated were all figures of authority, very clever people, professional people who are looked up to and admired. That's obviously something he felt he couldn't have in his normal life, and he needed it and craved it.
I've never ever come across a con man like Paul Bint. He is very much a one-off.
Paul Bint has committed more than 100 offences and audaciously posed as doctors in hospitals, an aristocrat, a playboy, a property magnate, and even masqueraded as Orlando Pownall QC, the barrister who worked on the infamous Jill Dando murder trial in the UK. Such a relentless confidence trickster, the British press has crowned him King Con.
He's so deeply involved in playing these characters, and the temporary status and success that he achieves through them, that he can't kind of give them up. I guess he's kind of addicted to them. The thing that I guess makes him unusual, and that various forensic and criminal psychiatrists have concluded, is that there's no salvation in this story. He doesn't really seem to be coming to his senses at all.
And hospitals, it would seem, are the backdrop for his fantasy world. A hospital to him would be like Disney World to a 6-year-old.
And it was in hospitals that Paul Bint's first known con began. Incredibly, this man with no medical or surgical training whatsoever walked into a hospital in Kettering, Northants, England in 1983, posing as a locum doctor. Paul Bint stole a white coat and stethoscope and set to work, plundering from the sick and the dying and stealing from his so-called colleagues. A year later, Paul Bint was pulling exactly the same disturbing con in the capital at the Whittington Hospital, North London, England. On the A&E ward of the Royal Whittington Hospital, Bint assumed the identity of Dr. Dominic York. Bint had discovered that Dr. York had gone to work in the USA and so simply claimed he had returned to the UK sooner than expected. The man who coolly strolled into Whittington, using it as his hunting ground, cruelly took his con even further. When wearing his white coat, he perilously set to work as a doctor on the wards. While at the North London Hospital, despite no training, Paul Bint relished and performed a variety of tasks. He arranged x-rays, attended to a patient with a collapsed lung, and administered 12 stitches to a man with a head injury.
He'd managed to sneak his way into various hospitals, mostly in London it seemed during that period, steal a doctor's coat, often steal a stethoscope or other equipment or a pager.
Well, as soon as he put on the white coat, he was instantly, if you like, short-circuiting people's doubt and mistrust reaction. They were automatically inclined to trust him because they thought he was a doctor. So they're therefore going to put a lot more weight in things that he says. Now, how he was able to carry it on from there, I think it speaks a lot to his conman characteristics. He's obviously able to improvise and to talk a good game. He's able to sound convincing. Classic characteristics of a conman.
When talking about infiltrating the Royal Whittington Hospital in London, England, Paul Bint dubiously claims he studied medical books for 6 months, went through an interview process and won the position over 23 qualified doctors.
When I put to him that he was playing God with people's lives, that he was putting lives at risk, he said that, no, he'd studied the medical books. If there was something he wasn't sure of, he'd always refer it. And he claimed that he acted responsibly. I mean, that, again, just shows you the level of self-deception that's going on with such an individual.
The reality was he was an unremarkable man who had strolled in off the street and terrifyingly consulted with patients and administered treatments to seriously ill people. From the Whittington Hospital, Bint did shifts at St Bartholomew's Hospital in East London and the Hammersmith Hospital. At these British hospitals, his disturbing, dangerous and reckless behaviour continued.
It's fairly well documented that he did do a number of very alarming things, such as putting stitches in a man who came into accident and emergency with a head wound. He changed the drip on somebody, I think, come round after surgery. There was even a claim that he was present during emergency heart surgery in one hospital in London. So he was involved in some very serious medical situations.
He was putting lives potentially at risk by doing that, and he was manipulating them at a time when they were at their most vulnerable.
By arrogantly assuming the role of doctor, Paul Bint had found the perfect con and playground to support an extravagant lifestyle and to also fulfil his own warped fantasies of self-importance and grandeur.
By putting on a doctor's coat, you're taking advantage of what you might call the authority effect or the white coat effect, because doctors are a class of society who automatically command a lot of trust, and that's something that con men often do. They often pose as an authority figure.
And of course, people would respond to him very differently as Dr. Bint than Mr. Bint. So he would gain respect, he would have the trust of other people, which of course would allow him to exploit them.
I think Paul Bint obviously became a little bit of a Walter Mitty type character. He believed he was a doctor, he believed he had power over these patients, and that he was giving them care and attention in the way that a doctor would.
A good question is whether or not he realised that he was endangering people's health, or maybe even their lives, let alone their emotional state. And again, you have to ask whether he may have realised it, I don't know, but he probably didn't care, even if he did realise it, because he probably didn't have the same emotional processes that normal people have, so he didn't have a conscience in the same way that you and I would.
And this was just the beginning of a notorious and compulsive conman career. No one could predict the audacity and extremes Paul Bint would go to, his crimes only limited by his own imagination and fantasies. When off duty from his surgical scam, nightclubs were Bint's prowling ground of choice. He would use his false identities to seduce women. But he wouldn't just steal their hearts, he would steal their cash.
I mean, it's anything from him claiming to have slept with 1,000 women, and countless aliases, I think, from kind of aristocrats to kind of double-barreled barristers. And even one of his defence counsels actually said he makes Walter Mitty look like a 9 o'clock newsreader.
Paul Bint is a serial conman whose career has spanned 3 decades of shocking and unsettling scams. In the early 1980s, he infiltrated hospitals posing as a doctor and dangerously administered treatments to unsuspecting patients waiting for the care and attention from professional medical staff.
He often justified it by saying he was there on the front line, he probably saved a few lives, he pored over medical books, he'd done his research, he was responsible. If there was something he didn't know, he described it as a kind of sequential process being in an accident emergency. You would pass on a particular problem.
It's easy to get sidetracked by the fact that he'd taken on this persona of a doctor and was in the environment of hospitals. He was just a con man in the basic sense of the term, using that environment in order to get money from people.
But it wasn't just wish fulfillment and money on Paul Bint's mind. He used his fake status to practice his bedside manner outside the hospital. When not putting patients' lives at risk with his scandalous surgical scam, he compulsively scoured nightclubs in search of women. Bint claims to have slept with 1,000 women. He would take them to bed and then take their money. Paul Bint reportedly attempted to seduce women in nightclubs with the immortal line, "Trust me, I'm a doctor."
Supposedly one of his girlfriends said that was one of his pickup lines, where they were in a nightclub, he supposedly was fondling her breast and says, "Okay, trust me, I'm a doctor."
The reality of it is that Paul Bint would have been treated quite differently by females if they believed that he had the power and status that go with being a doctor. But crucially, he would have had more confidence when he was playing out those roles. So he wouldn't be able to impress women maybe on a normal day-to-day basis as himself, but as Dr. Bint or Barrister Bint, then of course he's going to have more charm, more confidence, and he's going to be more able to woo the ladies.
In all of my cases, women featured. It's part of his game, yes.
It's kind of interesting that he seems to have managed to con women of a certain age and education, often career women who are very, very successful in their lives, enjoying good careers and doing very well. And perhaps they kind of buy in just a little bit too much to the idea of who he is. Some of the women that I spoke to said that he can be a very kind of caring lover. And because he'd managed to, I guess, obtain a certain amount of money through other criminal work, he would often spend quite a lot of money on these women. It would always be with the idea that he was going to con them out of a much greater sum of money at the end.
Whilst serially conning women, Paul Bint could not keep away from hospitals. But his first run of success as a con man could not last forever. In 1983 and 1984, when Bint was posing as an A&E doctor, his life-threatening lies caught up with him, and he was arrested.
In the 80s, he received a couple of sentences. The first one was about 18 months for stealing doctors' coats and equipment and posing as a doctor. It's been claimed on many occasions by various defence counsels that he's suffering from some kind of mental illness or psychosis. In 84, the judge didn't accept it for 1 minute because she could see that he'd been operating in a very irresponsible and potentially life-threatening way and gave him a very stiff sentence of 5 years. Not that, of course, he learned anything from it.
After being released from prison, Paul Bint quickly returned to his Walter Mitty ways, but this time he adopted a brand new tack. He decided that the best way to con his way to richness, status, and into women's bedrooms was to adopt the personas of a string of wealthy, eminent, and successful individuals. He stole the tools necessary to create the illusion of wealth and status. Although no one can tell if he stole to convince people he was successful and wealthy, or if he convinced people he was successful and powerful in order to help him steal. He seemed to need both equally. He claimed to be the Duke of Arundel and invented the persona of a wealthy aristocrat called Piers Oppenheimer in order to successfully scam and seduce, but the police were always on his tail. They arrested him several times, and in 1988 he found himself back behind bars serving a 4-year sentence.
If he believes he is Piers Oppenheimer or he is, a double-barreled surnamed leading barrister, that's enough for him. And he'll ride it for as long as he can. So I think you probably need to have, on a deeper psychological level, you need to have extremely low self-esteem. And you need to have a commitment to see it through, even though you know it's going to catch up with you eventually.
The sort of people that Paul Bint sort of impersonated or took on personas of were all figures of authority, very clever people, professional people who were looked up to and admired. That's obviously something he felt he couldn't have in his normal life, and he needed it and craved it.
In 1993, released from prison, Paul Bint reverted to his old hunting ground of hospitals. Once again, he would put seriously ill patients' lives at risk by posing as a doctor in a bid to feed his ego and his wallet. In 1993, he infiltrated St James's Hospital in Leeds, England, before breaching security at the nearby York District Hospital, where the cold-hearted con reached new heights in terms of its cruelty towards Bint's victims.
He told the parents of a 17-year-old girl who'd just been involved in an accident that their daughter would live, and 6 hours later she died. Now, you could say that's emotionally reckless. I mean, again, you wouldn't expect a con man to have any consideration of their actions. I mean, he was kind of cold and calculating in that process. So there's that kind of emotional cruelty, but there's clearly the very serious matter of him being in a position where potentially someone could have died because he could have made the wrong diagnosis or performed the wrong emergency operation.
I mean, to tell the parents of a child that they're going to live only to find out a short while later that that's just not true is treating people's emotions with such disdain. It's horrible.
After causing this devastation and heartache, Paul Bint was briefly held at a psychiatric hospital in Yorkshire. But once released in 1993, he headed to Lancashire, England, and walked into the Royal Preston Hospital, ready to continue his compulsive surgical scam.
In Preston General Hospital, he's offered to act as an anaesthetist with one case. So again, very serious, life-threatening decisions that he was making.
In the instance when I dealt with him at Royal Preston Hospital, which was actually on Boxing Day of 1993, he'd gone to Royal Preston Hospital and claimed he was a locum covering for the surgical registrar. He knows the layout of hospitals. He went to the telephonist room. He obtained the surgical registrar's pager and had all his calls diverted to himself. One of the great dangers with this was that the surgical registrar was on a major incident team, so if over that Christmas-New Year period there'd been a major incident, obviously he wouldn't have been able to be contacted because Paul Bint had the pager.
When Paul Bint was playing the role of Dr. Bint, he would have been very deeply immersed in his fantasy life. And so actually the people who he was applying treatment to him would just be like extras in a TV production. And they would just be tools for him really to act out his fantasies. He probably didn't see them as real people at all.
I believe that his basic motive for entering hospitals was to steal. He would go in knowing that there were good pickings if he could get into the consultant surgeons' changing rooms near to the operating theatres, and then would steal wallets containing credit cards. And then he would use those credit cards to obtain money to live off for some time.
I view Paul Bint as a compensatory narcissist. So what that means is that the reality of himself is so inadequate that he wants to escape from that. So he retreats into a fantasy world. He'll be preoccupied with fantasies of himself as brilliant, as successful, as confident, and everything that he would wish to be.
But it's also got to be about control and about power, and potentially also always lead you to the women. By posing as a doctor, he often would meet people in that environment that he would then form relationships with.
A woman he was seeing in Preston, England, began to see through his white coat and stethoscope.
He spoke so often about his work at Royal Preston, his work as a doctor. It was basically his sole topic of conversation. And if they were out socially, he continually referred to the fact he was a doctor. Because he was in her company for a few weeks, she eventually thought that this just cannot be genuine. She was an intelligent girl, and her mother as well began to feel that there was something not right about Paul Bint.
The woman contacted the police and the truth unfolded. But even in custody, Paul Bint's lies kept coming.
On arrest, he'd given false details. He'd indicated he was Dr. David Watkin, whose details he'd obtained from a wallet he'd stolen from Leicester Royal Infirmary. He went through an interview claiming to be this person, and then we indicated near the end of the interview that we knew who he was from his fingerprint records, that we knew he was Paul Bint, and we knew his past record. He then wanted to be my best friend because he wanted bail, he wanted to get out again, and there was no realistic hope of him getting bail because it was obvious that he'd re-offend and he'd abscond.
Paul Bint was refused bail, and when he faced trial in October 1994, was once again sent to prison, this time for 5 years. However, Michael Tominey put into action a plan that was intended to prevent Paul Bint ever repeating his hospital scam in the future.
On his release in 1996, I arranged through the health service to have an early warning system when Paul was released from prison. I informed all the hospitals nationally, and we did a circulation to all police forces informing people that he was out and about. And I understand that that system still continues to this day.
But why does Paul Bint continue to revert to his surgical scam? When exploring his past, there are clues to help uncover and understand why Bint fixates upon and relentlessly targets hospitals in his cons.
His reason was that he says that when he was the age of 12, he went into hospital to have an appendix operation. He says because of his parents splitting up and because of a difficult family background, he says it was the first time that he'd experienced unconditional care and love and a kind of safe environment.
I think that is the point where the obsession started, and he seems to have made no secret of that by saying the incident of him having his appendix out, that was clearly a catalyst for his behaviour in the future.
It is possible that when Paul went to hospital and had his appendix out, that the treatment he received from hospital staff was the best treatment that he'd actually had as a child so far. So that's very sad, and that tells you where the roots of his fantasy life started. But of course that's not a whole explanation for his behaviour. His behaviour is complex and it's bizarre.
And it's probably wrong to try and explain a whole lifetime of pathological behaviour with one incident like that. But it does give us a clue, I think, as to his motivations, which is that he obviously associated being a doctor and being in that medical environment with a lot of things that were positive attributions for him. So he obviously felt kind of happy and safe and cared for in that hospital environment. And then later on, by posing as doctor, he could presumably get all those things you get when you put on a white coat: respect, admiration, people listening to you, people paying attention to you. So you can see how that would drive him.
For reasons of escape and control, I think from a very early age he pretended to be other people and found that that was a way of wiping those kind of problems clean.
And so by claiming that he was actually helping people, he's trying to justify his own actions in a pretty feeble way, but you know, his psychology in that sense is pretty feeble, so he's able to convince himself.
I mean, one of his former girlfriends said to me that the thing about Paul Bint is that he's never come to terms with his own ordinariness.
By 1996, Paul Bint was once again out of prison, and his compulsion to live out his conman fantasies was stronger than ever. This time, the serial confidence trickster had a new destination and target in mind. He was heading north, to Scotland.
And I looked out and he was gone and the car was gone. Because I thought, that's a bit odd, because I still had the car keys.
Since the early 80s, Paul Bint has spent time in and out of prison. Over 25 years, he has made a career of adopting aliases to dupe the public on an eclectic and extraordinary collection of levels. But his primary focus has always been infiltrating hospitals and posing as doctors, administering dangerous, life-threatening treatments and stealing from the staff and patients.
By putting on that identity, maybe in his own twisted psychology, he was somehow short-cutting straight to all those attributes that he valued so much, you know, respect, status, without actually having to work for it.
After serving time for the northwest of England surgical scam, it wasn't long before Paul Bint once again set to work conning. And his legacy of cons are not always of the medical variety. By 2000, Paul Bint was in court after tricking rail chiefs into putting him up in a luxury hotel in Edinburgh, Scotland, after posing as Lachlan Campbell Brereton, the QC involved in the Lockerbie bombing trial. And this would not be the last time he would pose as an esteemed lawyer. However, upon release, Paul Bint returned to Scotland and the cons continued. In 2001, he was passing himself off as a millionaire property magnate. Bint, under another alias, made an appointment at a luxury car dealership and appeared to be in the market to acquire a sporty number.
He introduced himself as Paul Blenheim. He says he was a property agent or a property dealer. He was actually in Glasgow that day looking at a nightclub in the city centre that was for sale, and he'd actually seen the cars advertised here, so he'd made a phone call to us.
He was masquerading as a wealthy millionaire, not a famous named person, but somebody with a great deal of money. And he had the air to carry it off, and indeed the expensive clothes.
Well, he was very well dressed, and his mannerism was like well educated, well spoken, sort of English spoken, just like an educated businessman.
His MO, his modus operandi, is to first of all look the part. So he'd have on his £3,000 Versace suit, which obviously turns out to be a jumble sale suit. He'd carry a copy of the FT. He'd have a state-of-the-art mobile phone, an organiser, and BlackBerry or whatever. He said that he was. You shouldn't really laugh, I guess, although there is a kind of comical side to it. He said he owned a hotel in Mauritius, I think, a nightclub in London. He had property in Edinburgh and London. And on the face of it, I guess he looked like a kind of cast-iron prospect. You imagine the kind of pound signs registering in the salesman's eyes.
He says he was in the market for a very expensive sports car, so he looked at a few and he asked if we could take a test drive in a Ferrari.
He would drop into the conversation various information that he gathered about the cars, because, I mean, it's true that he has driven a number of Porsches and Bentleys and Aston Martins in the past, so he has actually got some experience of driving, obviously not at all in a legal way, mostly through having stolen them.
Conmen quite often use elements of truth in their lies because it's so much easier to make yourself believe that you're telling the truth if some of what you're saying is actually the truth.
So we took him a test drive in the Ferrari. It was maybe just a wee bit too sporty, noisy for him, so he decided to suit his image. He would go for the Aston Martin because it was more, as you would say, a sort of gentleman's sports car. Normally a customer wants to drive a car to see the like and feel of it, so because I drove a Ferrari, I just took him out and just let him drive the Aston Martin and I was in the passenger seat. Then he decided basically he was going to buy the car, made a few phone calls, organised with his bank to pick up a bank draft.
With everything appearing above board, Ross Campbell and his customer, Mr. Blenheim, aka Paul Bint, had time to kill until the banker's draft would be cleared and the sale completed.
So we stopped for lunch. So I says, well, this pub here is just open, we'll go in there. And he parked the car. I took the key and locked the car. Then went into the pub. Right away he was using his phone, so I ordered up a couple of drinks and sandwiches. And he says, I'm just going to pop out to use my phone.
They thought he'd popped out for a moment to make a phone call. He in fact popped out and stole the car. And off he went, filled it up with petrol and didn't even pay for that.
The drinks arrived, the sandwiches arrived, so I thought, I'll just see where he is, give him a shout. And I looked out and he was gone and the car was gone. Which I thought, that's a bit odd because I still had the car keys.
Conned and carless. It had all been lies. There was no bank draft and now there was no car. Unbeknownst to Ross Campbell, Bint had surreptitiously pocketed the spare keys to the Aston Martin back at the showroom when he was viewing the car's service history file. He had struck again. All Ross Campbell could do was wait and see if the £55,000 sports car would ever be seen again.
The Aston Martin was recovered 4 days later. It had 900 miles on the clock. I think he'd used it to drive around various girlfriends that he was duping at the time. And he'd managed to do £15,000 worth of damage.
Then when the CID came to interview me, then they basically took a description, showed me photographs, then told me basically this chap is a con man, he's got a lot of convictions, he's one of Britain's most wanted con men.
In a developing pattern, the police again caught up with Bint and he found himself back behind bars. But on his release from prison in 2002, Paul Bint lost little time in getting started on his next scam, a scam that shrewdly drew together many of the key elements of his past crimes, creating his most comprehensive con yet.
He was released on the 11th of December. He's in London by the 12th of December. And he's certainly a man who just cannot stop.
People who are compulsive liars are very difficult to treat. Psychologists say that, quite often they think they're normal. It's everyone else that's not quite right.
And once again, hospitals were on the agenda. Although this time he wasn't masquerading as a doctor, this time he was a patient. Like in 2000, Paul Bint was once again presenting himself as a high-profile British barrister. This time he was claiming to be Orlando Pownall QC.
He was impersonating Orlando Pownall, Queen's Counsel, who is an eminent lawyer, a name probably well known to a number of people. He had prosecuted the case involving the murder of Jill Dando, the defendant Barry George. He was also involved around the time in a high-profile murder case of Danielle Jones, which was up in Chelmsford.
Someone like Orlando Pownall, the QC in the Jill Dando murder trial, would have been in the public eye at the time this was going on. He'd been in the papers and Paul Bint would have seen his name and seen him as a character that people were reading about. And that's probably why he picked up on his identity and used it.
Released from prison in Scotland just 2 days earlier, Paul Bint had a new alias, and with the new identity came a convincing and inspired backstory to execute his most ambitious scam yet.
What he did do was arrive in London with no money, as far as we're aware, and nowhere to stay. And so he did attend local hospitals, 3 in total. He gave the same story at all 3, that he was Orlando Pownall QC. He had crashed his Aston Martin. He believed that he had received internal injuries. He was in pain, and he then submitted himself to certain hospital tests, although he did indicate he was allergic to iodine, which I understand meant that certain tests couldn't be carried out. Of the tests that were carried out, in his urine was a concerning amount of blood, sufficient for the doctors to want to keep him in for observation for some time. And I have no doubt that that blood was put in by him. He had not been in a car accident. He had got off the train.
Like many of Bint's audacious cons of the past, this continued to feed his ego and his bizarre fantasy life.
Well, he would give a medical history, and he just can't resist adding exciting bits. And part of the medical history on one of his notes, or one of his sets of hospital notes that I saw, was that he indicated that he had some shrapnel as a result of being involved in the Hyde Park bombings. Simply part of his medical history, but something of... nothing's ever straightforward with him at all.
Someone who becomes a Walter Mitty type character actually takes on the persona of that character and almost completely believes themselves to be that person.
And this con combined elements of his most notorious scams.
He has a love of fast cars, none of which ever belonged to him legitimately, but it's something that certainly he had stolen when he was masquerading as a millionaire up in Scotland. The irony is that he comes down to London and professes to have crashed one and uses that in his scam right from the outset.
The fact that he'd actually been arrested for stealing an Aston Martin, using that in the story when he pretended to be Orlando Pownall, allowed him to create a much more effective and plausible lie, because some of it was in fact true. He'd been in an Aston Martin.
trappings like the Aston Martin or a smart suit, they are absolutely essential to cons, particularly the type of con that he was trying to pull. And in con parlance, that's called putting on the dog, which is basically where you act the part. And that's based on some very important victim psychology. So if you're trying to pretend to be rich, for instance, but you don't look rich, you don't look wealthy, you don't look sophisticated, then the people you're trying to hobnob with will automatically suspect you, and they'll have an instant barrier of mistrust. But that works against them because they think they're protected against people who are trying to rip them off, for instance, because they think they can spot those people. But they automatically are more likely to accept people that seem like them, that seem well-to-do, that have a convincing air about them.
Clearly it wasn't enough for him just to sort of try and pretend to be these people. He needed those extra trappings, the fast cars and the girlfriends and the nice houses. He needed all that other stuff as well to bolster his feeling of being powerful.
There is some continuity between his stories in that he may adapt a theme and continue it. Certainly in this case, it was interrupted by some years in prison between the two incidences.
Straight out of prison, Paul Bint had found a unique way to cope with the fact he didn't have a bed of his own to sleep in, and that bed ensured he had constant care and attention.
Well, in the hospital, he's taking a bed away from another patient, but he has a roof over his head, a nice warm roof over the Christmas period. He has dinner, bed and breakfast, and he has some bodies, as far as the nurses and doctors are concerned, who in effect cater to his every need.
Con artists, a lot of what drives them is they do get a thrill out of proving to themselves somehow that they're a cut above the common herd, and that they're a step ahead, and that they're, that they've put one over on you. And I suspect that Paul Bint probably did get a big thrill out of that, and that's probably part of what motivates him, because I think it's part of what motivates a lot of con artists. So it's all about having put one over on someone and proving that you are smarter and faster and better than they are.
Settled into University College Hospital, London, England, Paul Bint knew his scam had a shelf life. So, from his sick bed, he spotted a female doctor who was to become his next unsuspecting victim. His charm offensive began, and she believed his lies. He was Orlando Pownall, QC.
They met and exchanged numbers, so I understand, whilst on hospital premises, but she didn't and wasn't involved in his treatment at all. And contact was made by him after he had left the hospital. And as I understand it, they met up, and he indicated that there was a problem with his accommodation. He said his father lived in Millionaire's Row, and but for some reason he couldn't stay there, and he persuaded her to use a room, which is what he did, just used a room in her house for a short period of time, but that gave him access to her belongings, her money, and such like.
And Bint took advantage of her generosity.
He took the laptop computer, he took cheques, he took money, both from her purse and indeed by apparently borrowing it and of course never returning it, and more than one credit card, all of which were used to buy, in the main, extremely expensive suits. He would fully clothe himself in top designer wear.
But it wasn't long before she became suspicious.
They went to a party and he didn't even have any money on him. He'd have forgotten his wallet, and so he'd asked just to borrow some money from her, and it became increasingly apparent over those, and it was a very few days, that this was a man who said a lot but did very little. And she also caught him going through items of hers at home and became increasingly suspicious about that, and that resulted in her finally asking him to leave on Christmas Eve.
It was shortly after she had asked him to leave that the trusting female doctor heard some spine-chilling news, that Orlando Pownall QC was actually on holiday in Barbados with his family, and the man she had been sharing her home with was in fact an imposter. She immediately called the police.
Orlando Pownall, Queen's Counsel, was not in the country at the time. In fact, he was overseas on holiday with his family. So once that was discovered, the police were notified, and the police, within an incredibly short period of time, linked it immediately to being Mr. Bint.
Once more, the hunt for Paul Bint, King Con, was on. Paul Bint has been working as a con man for over 25 years, adopting many aliases. There is a recurring theme in Bint's conman career. Whether posing as a doctor or a patient, he seems obsessed with hospitals. But are his actions those of an opportunist conman, someone who is clinically ill, or is he suffering from some sort of psychological disorder, such as Munchausen syndrome, whereby the subject tries to get attention by feigning illness? In Bint's case, experts believe his motivations are much more complicated.
Part of the psychology of Munchausen syndrome sufferers is that they're really seeking attention, and they're willing to go through painful or invasive medical procedures if it means they can be the centre of attention. And you can see the same psychology at work in Bint's case, in that he relished the attention.
Munchausen syndrome is a label that you could apply to Paul Bint. This is when people contrive symptoms of physical illness so that they can receive care and attention. But also, Paul was willing to play the role of doctor, not just the role of patient. So it seems to me that the important thing is access to this environment where he can play out his fantasies. And so I would think that maybe a label that's best applied to him would be narcissist. Narcissists are people who are very preoccupied with fantasies of themselves as somebody who's special, who has power and importance and status and receives special attention.
In 2002, 2 weeks after being released from prison in Scotland for stealing an Aston Martin, Bint was touring hospitals in London, England. This time as a patient instead of a doctor. He was posing as eminent QC Orlando Pownall, claiming he had crashed his fictitious Aston Martin and now had internal injuries. After successfully using the scam to get free bed and board at University College Hospital, London, England, Paul Bint conned a female doctor into letting him stay with her. After she discovered he'd been stealing from her, she asked him to leave. She then discovered he was not who he claimed to be, and she told the police. Unaware the police were again hunting for him, Paul Bint was once again homeless and pulled his scam again, this time audaciously turning up at Hemel Hempstead Hospital near London by ambulance.
Christmas Eve, he's homeless again, and he attends another hospital at Hemel Hempstead. He, as I recall, arrived by ambulance on that particular occasion, so how he did that I don't know. But once he arrived, it was the same story. Eminent QC, Aston Martin, internal injuries, blood in the urine.
Oblivious that the police had been alerted to his crimes and were looking for him, Paul Bint continued to go about his business, using hospitals as his hunting ground.
Money went missing from patients. The gentleman in the bed next to him lost some money. So did Mr. Bint. Mr. Bint lost, I think, 3 or 4 times the amount of money, apparently. Mr. Bint blamed the staff in the hospital. So money was clearly obtained. And the gentleman in the bed next door, his daughter, was taken in by Mr. Bint.
If someone really targets you and gets to know you very well and manipulates you to a large degree, and you're a basically trustful person, it's very difficult not to be conned.
Paul Bint was discharged from Hemel Hempstead near London, England, but with nowhere to stay, headed to a third hospital with exactly the same story.
When he was released from that hospital, he went to the Whittington Hospital and did the same story again. And he stayed in the Whittington Hospital up until New Year's Eve. Whilst he's there, and this is one of the not-so-nice sides of Mr. Bint's character, he steals a credit card from a man who was dying, who is now dead, Mr. Lewis, in the adjoining bed, and uses that to wine and dine the female that he met in the second hospital.
He's reasonably good looking, although again you look closely, he kind of dyes his hair and he's certainly not as young as he claims that he is. But if he comes in the flash suit and he's often got a wallet full of money. I think when I was spending time with him in Edinburgh, he was carrying around £2,000 worth of cash. So perhaps superficially you can see why it might fool some people. It might look the kind of part, and you might believe who he is, and you might think, well, here's an interesting individual with lots of money who can show me a good time.
You're also taking advantage of what in psychology is called the halo effect, which is if you come across well because you're good looking or because you're charming or personable or whatever, you're more likely to be attributed with characteristics that you don't have, such as trustworthiness or intelligence.
He preys on certain people, either by flattery or by taking advantage of them. For example, with the woman that he took away for the night with the stolen credit card, her father had been admitted to hospital after a serious emergency on Christmas Eve, and she clearly was not herself when she met this man who was larger than life.
You could look at it that he gets a certain amount of financial, sexual and kind of status validation from doing it. I mean, by pretending to be a leading barrister or a ballet dancer or whoever, he clearly enjoys the way people respond to that.
Money isn't always the only motive. I think sometimes it's the emotional bolstering to feel important and clever and to be admired by others that is often the payback for these lies.
On the 2nd of January, just over 3 weeks after his release from prison and a hat-trick of hospitals later, the police once again caught up with Paul Bint by playing on one of his key weaknesses: women. While in hospital, Bint had pursued a woman who had spurned his advances, but she agreed to help the police and arranged a date with the con man. Only their romantic evening would be gate-crashed by the constabulary.
As I understand it, it was arranged that one of the women who he had been trying to take out, who had refused him, in fact contacted him, and she encouraged the future meeting which the police attended when he was arrested.
Paul Bint as a con man is actually not that effective. He's been caught almost every time he's done anything to try and get money or property. What he's successfully achieved is to create personas for himself, to give himself moments in time where he can be respected and loved by other people. So he's a fantasist, and in that respect he's been successful. But as a con man, he's a bit of a disaster.
In October 2003, Paul Bint pleaded guilty to charges including theft and attaining properties by deception. The judge said to Bint, "You have caused anguish, embarrassment, loss and difficulty to your victims." The judge also said a psychiatric report had concluded that Bint suffered from a currently untreatable psychopathic disorder, and so his case would not be dealt with under the Mental Health Act. Paul Bint was sentenced to 4 years and 4 months in prison.
Paul Bint has obviously created something like 25 different aliases, different personas of his own personality, and it is... You have to wonder whether he still knows who Paul Bint and whether Paul Bint exists today, or is still that little boy in the hospital bed having his appendix out.
Paul Bint's conman career creates a fascinating case file, not simply because of the audacity and perseverance he has exhibited, but because of the way he seems to thrive on his notoriety. Unlike other conmen who by definition attempt to live anonymously, Bint has courted the press and even been interviewed by glossy magazines.
I'm sure Paul Bint does enjoy people writing about him and the attention that he gets from being a con artist. People tend to view con artists as chancers, as rogues, rather than actually the criminals that they are. And so this would probably be quite an attractive identity for a man who has a very fragile sense of himself.
In the kind of the colourful annals of British criminal history, he certainly stands out. He was dubbed by the police at one time King Con, and because the tabloids have written about him as Britain's cruelest con man.
Paul Bint has committed over 100 offences, appeared in court over 20 times, and spent almost a decade of his 25-year conman career in custody. Now released, there are fears Paul Bint will never stop.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if Paul Bint reoffended on release.
The way that he's unable to go straight, if you like, for even a day is quite telling, but con artists often find it hard to go straight because they're just not used to doing anything else. What could Paul Bint have done for a real job? Would he have been equipped for a normal life? He probably felt not.
I personally don't think he will have learnt anything. I don't think he'll even have learnt from his mistakes. I think he'll do it again, and I think he'll be caught again.
As much as you might think he's the lovable rogue, As much as there's been some humorous things written about him being this Walter Mitty character, there's a very dangerous and sinister side to him, and the safest place for Paul Bint, quite frankly, is in jail.